Hello and welcome to Chaos Dwarf Radio, the Brazen broadcast, brought to you from a dumpster around the back of Forge World Studios. My name is Oxymandias, and today with me I have Reaver.
Hey guys.
MichaelX.
Hey, what's up?
And Chitzkoi.
Hi everyone.
Now today, guys, we are going to be discussing a few different topics. We're going to be talking about the Age of Sigmar new box set that's coming out, because some of the contents of that set, the green skins, the Hobgoblins in particular, are going to be of massive interest to our listeners. We're also going to be talking a little bit about Kdaii Fireborn. And for those of you who don't know, these are the kind of fire, lava, demon creatures that came out with the Forge World range of Chaos Dwarfs. Unfortunately not available to purchase in shops anymore, but we're going to be talking about what can listeners do to create Kdaii Fireborn for their armies? What models can they purchase, or what conversions can they create in order to get those in their army? And finally, we're going to be doing something that we haven't actually done on this podcast before, and that's going to be an interview. We're going to be interviewing Tyranno, who has just finished up work on the 9th Age Hobgoblin army book. So it's an army book, a bit like a Warhammer army book or a codex, but for the game 9th Age, to allow users to create and play a fully Hobgoblin force. There are rules in that game to have Hobgoblin allies or slaves to your Chaos Dwarves, but his team has created a book where you can actually play as a fully Hobgoblin army, and they have a really unique take on that. That's something we recorded earlier this week, myself and Chitz did, so we'll be tacking out onto the end of this episode. So maybe we should start off, fellas, before we get into the kind of bulk of this podcast. Maybe we should talk a little bit about what we've been doing lately in terms of hobby, and I'll talk about your life. I'm not going to stop you. So I've been working on a certain piece of siege artillery for the Artisans contest that is coming up. But unfortunately, my poor Arscan, which is looking at me with his sad expression on the other side of my hobby room right now, he has been somewhat neglected in that I've sculpted about 70% of it and then done what I always do and gone and got obsessed in lots of other projects, which is something I'm very guilty of. In fact, my most recent project that I've been utterly obsessed with has been my historical army, my 28mm Romans. This is something I talked to Admiral about. I relapse. I'm like a Roman addict. Every 6 or 7 months in my life, it just happens that I'll watch a documentary or read a book or something, and then the only thing in my life I'll be caring about is early Imperial Rome. It will pass, and then I'll get back on with my life, and then it will happen again. So at the moment, I'm absolutely knee-deep in historical miniatures. And Michael, you'll be dead proud of me, mate. Apart from the models I already owned, which was 40 auxiliary troops, I'm 3D printing the lot. This is going to be a fully 3D printed army, apart from the stuff that I had before I got a 3D printer.
Nice.
So I don't think it will ever stack up to your Chaos Dwarf endeavours, because that is something else. That is astronomical levels of printing going on there, but this is a 3D printed army I'm working on. But yeah, that's been me really. I've been doing that. I've been chipping away at the zine as well, doing a little bit of editing here and there and that, and kind of cracking on. Oh, and for those of you that care, I got married as well, but that's not very interesting. Let's talk about the hobby. Chitz, what have you been up to?
Talking of life events, I've been going through the biggest challenge that any miniatures hobbyist can face, which is I'm moving house and I've got to bring all my toys with me. So I've been putting it all in boxes and then reorganizing the boxes and then rattling them to see if they rattle, and then reorganizing them again. And I've been, because I'm a bit of a closet hobbyist, I've been writing vague names on the side of the boxes so that nobody outs me. And just sort of generally getting a grip on my collection and the Grey Mountain, which is absolutely enormous. But sadly, it looks like I won't be moving until September time now, so it'll all be in boxes over summer in a storage unit. And then in eBay terms, those of you who know me know that I broker for people across the internet who are looking to finish their collections. And what I've been doing is I've been helping to help people finish their Dogs of War collections. I've got a couple of regiments that are still kind of sitting on the offers. but I've moved them incredibly fast. Who knew that Dogs of War minis was so popular? But they really are. And of course, as you all know, I've been keeping the best ones for myself. I'm going to be using Rico's Republican Guard as a set of armored Chaos Dwarf War Slaves. And I'm also going to be looking really carefully at Bronzino and the Bronzino's Galloper guns as well to feature in that force that I'm developing.
Nice, nice. I find Dogs of War are like on so many people's list of the army I wish I'd got. And I don't know if that's just because they went up in value so much over the years, but I know so many hobbyists who were hobbying in the 90s or were aware of the hobby from the 90s who now say to me, I bloody wish I'd got Dogs of War, or what good proxies are there for Dogs of War? It's a real army people miss, isn't it?
Yeah, I think there's like half a dozen reasons why it's so popular, right? The most basic one though is that people like the human factions, they like the heroes, and the Dogs of War had a unique flavor to them that meant that even if you didn't like the whole army, you probably saw one or two really visually distinctive regiments where you were like, I like that
Yeah.
aesthetic. And for me, that's the heavily armored Pavis crossbowmen, Braganza's besiegers, and the heavily armored pikemen, Rico's Republican Guard. Those are the ones that I think are truly cool. And then, of course, a lot of you guys will know I have an enormous number of Ogla Khan's Wolf Boys, and Gazak Khan as a leader. And, you know, that's only 4 out of maybe a dozen regiments of renown, but that is more than enough to keep me busy. And whenever I meet a collector, I sold all of the sculpts for Pirazzo's Lost Legion, who are like conquistador themed pike or crossbowmen. You could build them either way. That's just so much more intense and flavorful than like another Plastic Empire release. And so I think those minis came out and we were all just like kids and we couldn't buy them. And now a lot of people want to get them in their collections.
No, I think you're right. I think you're right, mate. Absolutely, it's still a really, really beloved faction. In fact, I was looking at the fan book that Matthias Ellison done for his Warhammer Armies project. The Dogs of War fan book for 8th Ed looks like a lot of fun. And actually, talking of the Romans I've been painting up, it looks like the best way of getting them into friendly 8th Ed games.
That's hilarious. The other thing I love the most about that, though, is that I do think that Dogs of War is a bit of a spiritual cousin to us. They're not as oppressed over the years because ultimately, you know, you do what you can with them, but they are a heavily fan-supported faction that's got many high-quality Warhammer Armies PDFs out there on the internet. And I think, you know, they had one release and then they were squatted, basically. And that's what happened to us.
Yeah, I suppose that it leaves people wanting more, doesn't it? I like that. Yeah, I think you're right. Probably are a spiritual cousin to the old Chaos Dwarf. Nice one. MichaelX, what you been working on, mate?
Well, as most of you know, I've been working on my, well, the same as you, on my competition sculpt, with also the butt theme. But yeah, I sculpted it quite quickly, actually. I was done maybe a month ago with, no, that's not true, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. And then I slapped some paint on it. And then I got to the point where the base colors were done, and it was, well, more than base colors. It was like leaning into the painting stuff or the detail stuff. And I was like, I need to take a short break, you know, to clear the palette, so to speak. So I quit, and in that week I got sick. Some of you may know, but my daughter got COVID from school, and then I got it. And long story short, I felt like painting for the first time yesterday, so I did a bit of detailing on it. And in between, I also printed some kill teams and stuff like that. So it's not that I didn't do any hobby stuff, but sitting down to paint just felt just a bit too much. So yeah, that's basically what I've been doing since last podcast and this podcast.
I mean, massively appreciating you coming out and doing today as well, Michael. I know your energy levels must be quite low and stuff because obviously it's an horrible thing to get. Family all good, mate?
Yeah, we're all fine. It's 2 more days of, well, 3 more days with the weekends included of quarantine, and then it's all good. So Yeah, mostly we're all just, well, my wife and I are a bit tired. The kids are insanely, they didn't have any symptoms. Unfortunately for us, they were just very energetic. So it's been rough, but other than that, yeah, no big problems,
I
luckily.
mean, it's a godsend they had no symptoms. That's a good thing, obviously. But yeah,
Absolutely.
when kids are at their maximum energy, well, you're at your lowest energy. That's a horrible combination.
Yeah. Thing is, if you're sick yourself and your kids are sick, that's bad too because you have to take care of them while
True.
still taking care of yourself. But when they're like hyperactive and you're just like, I want to sleep. Let me be. Yeah, that's rough. And also for them, I mean, we've been home for the school was closed for 4 weeks, and then they went to school for, well, the oldest went to school for maybe 3 weeks or something like that, and then this happened, and we've been in quarantine for maybe 32 days now, something like that, about a month. And they like being home with us, but when you're working and then after work you're exhausted and you have to, like, do household chores and stuff like that, they just want your attention and they want to play with you and stuff like that. But yeah, it's rough on them, mentally. My oldest one is old enough to understand what's going on, but still, she acts out and she regressed somewhat in her cognitive abilities and like bedwetting and stuff like that. It's probably going a bit too far in details here, but it's rough on the kids. Rougher on them than on us, I suppose.
Like I say, mate, you're a bloody trooper for coming out today, and we really appreciate it. I'm glad the family's good, because obviously that shit can be, well, we know it can be bloody awful, can't we?
Well, it's good to be here. It's fun to. This is motivating to make me. This is motivating me to paint and be active in the hobby again. So it's a good thing for me to be here.
Yeah, nice one, nice one. And Reaver, what have you been up to, my friend?
Well, not entirely sure. Probably not a whole lot of actual painted minis. The battle against the gray has gone much slower since about 3 rooms of my apartment have been taken up with various phases of an ass cannon build, of course. But just finished cleaning up the various messes that were involved in that today, and set up some nice lights to take pictures of my ass very in high detail before it goes in the airbrush booth to get painted. So good progress. It was a lot of fun. Yeah, looking forward to seeing what everybody has to display in about a month, I believe. So that took up a lot of time. Super fun build. I'm excited to have brought together some old bits from a lot of various sources that had no rights sitting for as long as they did. So yeah, it was a fun build. I think the only other thing, miniature hobby wise, painted a couple of Wargame exclusive models, some of their Star Wars, the Mandalorian, who's the Vindalorian assassin, or Vindicare assassin. I'm trying to remember the actual GW name, but their proxy for that, and the little grot in a pram, baby grot in a pram. So those are fun. Ended up painting those up for a giveaway that I just mailed out today. Had a crack at some non-metallic metal, kind of following on from what I was doing in my Bloodborne minis. So that was fun, super different. Hadn't done a 40K model in quite a while, so yeah, it was entertaining.
Nice.
Started. Not too much else. I was on vacation last week for, well, really just over a long weekend. Had a chance to go home and dig out some of my old oil pastel work and get some woodworking done. Help my dad set up a bunch of his tools for the summer, clean out the garage, and we were able to kind of experiment with his new router table and build a frame for one of my old pieces to get that so it's not curled up in a tube like it has been for the last 12 years.
And Reaver, have you done any more in your Bloodborne, or is Bloodborne finished now?
Yeah, it's Bloodborne finished. That's funny. Well, I have another batch of about 30 miniatures. Mold lines relatively clean. Got about another 10 or 15 based and ready to be painted. They're going to be airbrushed in the same breath as the ass cannon build and a couple of other things. So nowhere close. Making very good headway through the boss miniatures, and kind of digging into some of the mobs that are like quantity 4 of each. So yeah, that one's going to be a long haul. And frankly, there will probably be some that I won't get to just because they're not terribly pleasing in terms of they don't seem like a fun endeavor to paint.
Yeah.
Talking specifically about like 3 kind of generic human miniatures with torches all glued to the same base in a very inconvenient way.
Oh, that's gonna be hard. Yeah, working around them and
Yeah,
stuff.
we'll see. There will be some that I'll probably paint one-offs just to have a painted version of it, but I probably will only do the quantity 4 of the miniatures on the ones that I'm interested in painting, or would just be easy and fast. But making my way right now through the Vile Bloods expansion, which is all very in theme with some recent GW releases, although no centaurs are present.
Bloody bat centaurs. Don't get me started on bat centaurs.
Just some nice blood-sucking ticks and various little like castle knights and a couple of gargoyle-looking beasts. So one of my favorite areas of the game. So I'm going to be painting every miniature from that box. So
Models comes in this because I mean you mentioned expansion packs there. Have you bought multiple expansion packs? Because when you first told me you were painting up a board game, I very naively thought Hero Quest or something. But it seems like this is a lot of miniatures in it.
it's over 200.
Bloody hellfire! That's like painting an army.
Yeah. There were 12 boxes, 12 regular board game sized boxes that came in the mail.
Reeve, you never do anything by halves, mate. I respect that.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I committed to the basing, and that's going to take a while. But,
basing is killer like that, isn't it?
Yeah.
I did it with these Romans I'm painting. I realised that I could get a better crackle effect with the paint if I put down. I was using the Games Workshop textures, right? If I put down the brown sand one first and then let it dry, and then put the light brown crackle one on top of it, where it's going onto an uneven surface, you get a much nicer bumpy sort of crackle effect. Made the mistake of doing it on one model and liking it, and then realising I'm going to have to replicate that hundreds of times now.
Interesting. Nice. Yeah. These castle themed Bloodborne miniatures, I grabbed some no fire snow texture. So something I had at my house, grabbed that while I was home. So that'll make those go a little bit more speedy. I can cheat the cobblestone sculpting and lean into that a bit more. But there's a whole woods expansion that I'm doing tree roots and stuff all over that I just kind of dug into that. That'll take a while, but might be entertaining to hear. I'm not sure if I shared this, but I was trying to avoid buying packs of flowers because I really don't use them that much in basing. Just the little tufted flowers made of static grass and whatnot. It's not cheap to get the tools you need to DIY those, static grass applicator and some other things. So I was trying to figure out if I could get by on my own, and I ended up just making a horrendous mess on several occasions, not one of which was a terrible idea of just trying to take a Dremel tool to an Advil bottle and seeing if I could make like tiny little white shreds that I could tuft the top of a static grass clump. But I since gave up on those pursuits and bought like a relatively on sale pack of white flowers.
Yeah, sometimes you just got to look at the effort involved in. Some things are worth homemaking, some things aren't. That's a funny thing about this hobby. Like we often moan, don't we, about the workload and the stuff that we're doing and the standards we have to achieve. And sometimes you just have to sit back and go, we're choosing to do this. There's no boss breathing down my neck. For some reason, I feel like it's o'clock. I've got to get this done. I've got to get it to this standard. It's a funny old hobby, the pressure we put on ourselves. All right, fellas, I think that's probably time to start chatting about what we're going to be chatting about today. So, Age of Sigmar, new box set, new edition, new release. I take it you've all seen it, haven't you guys?
So I was watching it after I became convinced that it was going to happen. I was watching it on my phone on the top deck of a bus in blazing sunlight, desperately trying to disconnect and reconnect.
Brutal.
I got live update from shit, so yeah.
Yeah, I was also posting screen caps of everything to the Discord. By the way, you guys should join the Discord if you don't already have it.
Absolutely, you should definitely sign up. Reaver, did you listen to it live, or did you catch up with the news later on?
I mostly just sat in the Discord and let all the wonderful folks kind of keep me up to speed on that. That was about my level of engagement, as well as the whole 2 weeks leading up to the release.
Yeah, because the 2 weeks leading up to release was nothing if not filled with speculation on our forum and on our Discord, was it not? Because there had been some rumblings, there had been some rumours coming out that greenskins, the Destruction Force, but particularly greenskins, were going to be featuring quite heavily in this box. But also, quite early on, the word hobgoblins and the word wolf riders were being thrown around an awful lot. So to say our community, and it's interesting because our community isn't a primarily Age of Sigmar focused one. We have Age of Sigmar fans among us, but primarily kind of Warhammer Fantasy Battles, really, and a couple of other similar rank and flank games. But our community really got invested in this. Quite a lot, to the point where notifications were turned off once or twice, I have to admit.
Yeah, same here.
But I think, it's the excitement of being included in a mainstream release again, isn't it? It's the energy that comes of new sculpts and the kind of future that is heavily implied in this release. I can't blame people for getting excited about it, no matter how people feel about AOS as a system. The minis are the minis, right?
No, absolutely.
Absolutely. But the thing is, since I have a 3D printer, I have been so much or less involved in whatever a company like Games Workshop does. I'm still excited to see new Hobgoblins, but even if they had Hobgoblins at this time, I probably would have still printed my own because it's cheaper and I can print as much as I want without having to pay much extra. So I'm happy for the future because that means there's a small chance we can get even more and we can maybe get some new Chaos Dwarf. There's the hope for the future that's been reinforced. But other than that, yeah.
I mean, that's definitely the headline for the forum, right? Is that Cruel Boys are here are some Hobgoblins, but more importantly, you are definitely getting Chaos Dwarfs. We are going to explicitly or implicitly talk about them and make it clear that they have a relationship with the Hobgoblins, and therefore that you can probably expect them to be a release that is coming as part of this edition of Age of Sigmar, which means, we're probably a year to 2 years away from seeing a Chaos Dwarf range. It's crazy.
It does make the Asgore line being dropped make more sense if that is the case.
Yeah.
And I mean, part of me feels like everyone has, kind of knows the news, right? Like we've all talked about it on the forum and we've all talked about it. But in case anyone doesn't know, explicitly the Hobgoblins have been designed. They're called Hobgrotz now. They've got this very distinctive looking armor that doesn't resemble the armor of the other units in the Cruel Boys range. They've got this Dark Masters relationship that is clearly a reference to the Chaos Dwarfs that, we were told during the webcast was to do with their relationship in the world that was. And from that perspective, it does kind of make sense because AOS has had releases for all the major Chaos Gods. And as a result, they had kind of 2 or 3 choices. They can either go back to the start and do Khorne again, or they can come out with a Chaos range that's more distinctive this time around. And it seems clear that they're going to do Chaos Dwarfs in this edition because they've done the Hobgrotz and said that the Hobgrotz have like an economic relationship with Dark Masters, which can only mean one thing.
I hope so. I mean, speculation can be tricky. You can fill in gaps with what you wish instead of what you really know. But yeah, it definitely seems to point in the direction we all hope it will be pointing in.
And I think the real question for us as a group, before we move on to talk about the Hobgrotz in general, is if they Age of Sigmarify our beloved Chaos Dwarfs, they are not going to be the same as they were before. They are not going to be the big hats, and they are not going to be the grimdark big hats of the Legion of Asgore, because GW already made those miniatures, and GW never does an Age of Sigmar version of something that resembles what it was before. And if you look at the Hobgoblins and the way that they look really quite profoundly different, we've got to expect that the Chaos Dwarfs will look different as well. Which leaves us with the question, are you excited about the idea of an Age of Sigmarified Chaos Dwarf line or not?
I'll say my perspective on this is I'm excited for any love that Chaos Dwarfs as a faction get. And the reason for that is it will bring people into our forum, and it will bring people into our little budding Discord and community, and it will give us more people to talk to for the zine and all that kind of stuff. A rising tide raises all ships. You know, it would be a good thing for us. In terms of, am I excited for the Age of Sigmar take on what Chaos Dwarfs are? I'm going to have to really, really reserve my judgment, because, you know, once bitten, twice shy. A lot of the Age of Sigmar releases that have reimagined some of my favourite factions from the old world, some of it has been good, and this is obviously my point of view, others will disagree. Some of it has been so wacky and so out there that it's... Well, you can't ruin my childhood memories, they're still there. But it has certainly not lived up to my nostalgia and not lived up to my childhood memories. But then I have to remember, I'm not the target audience here, right? I'm a 30-year-old gamer who's been gaming for 20 years and has bought all those models from those eras that I want. They're aiming at new kid who's walking into the shop for the first time. And it's got to excite that kid, hasn't it? Because his hobby's got to continue. It's got to go into a new generation. So I'm not against change as such, but some of it is for me and some of it is not for me. It's kind of how I would word that.
You know, the thing is, for me, if they would release Chaos Dwarfs that are really different than what we have now, I think that would be the most interesting they could do. Because if they would release new Grimdark or Big Hat models, I know a lot of you would be really happy, but I already have access to those. You know, I can print as much of those as I want to. But if they would bring something new to the table, and hopefully it would be okay, you know, something we can use in a fantasy army of our choosing, then that would be great, because they would have something that nobody else would have. On the other hand, if they come out with something that's, you know, well, ugly, or I don't really care, you know, whatever they do to fuck it up, then, you know, no loss. I mean, still, Chaos Dwarfs will get some attention. Still, we will probably get some new members. So for me, this is definitely a win-win. Whether I'll buy the models or like the models is, well, irrelevant.
I'm definitely excited on behalf of like the forum, not just for the new blood effect, but also because of like the modeling opportunities that are going to come of a top quality GW plastic range. Now, there is the issue that like they have been tending towards more and more monopose as time's gone on, right? Hyper detailed, but fundamentally not as versatile as the old plastic regiments. And we're going to have to wait and see where they fall on that stuff. But I know that as hobbyists, we're going to use it as fuel for whatever our personal take on Chorfs is anyway. And I think no one's a better example of that than you, Oxy, because you've got this super 80s aesthetic Norse ice dwarf thing going on. It's not hugely directly aesthetically related to the big hat range at all, right? But in practice, you've taken a lot of inspiration and a lot of concepts from it, and I'm sure that even if it's a bit more Lumineth than, I don't know, what was a good AOS range? Reaver and I made a list the other day.
Gloomspite was pretty good.
Gloomspite, there you go.
Gloomspite was in the spirit of the old models, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And you know, even if that does happen, we'll turn it into whatever we want to turn it into. We do that all the time. We've been trained by like 20 years of obscurity. I don't want to step on anyone else. So is there anyone else want to comment on that before I go on to talk a little bit about the armor aesthetic and what it suggests?
Yeah, I mean, I think you guys pretty much covered it, but I'll just say from 2 weeks of not even having pictures of these hobgoblins, we had speculation flying around the forum, and there was already a host of fantastic and some very AOS ideas being thrown around. But just taking that as evidence, we have just 2 weeks of a ridiculous quantity of traffic on the Discord. Some really fantastic ideas, some rather hilarious concept art. Won't really get into descriptions on some of it, but just bringing that to the forum, that can't be a bad thing. So just, and like you guys have said, bringing, new plastic bits into that landscape can only help. From my perspective, and we'll get into more on the actual aesthetics of the hobgoblins themselves, but something I could see myself being interested in would be a new range of Chaos Dwarfs with a new aesthetic that I could see as something further east and as a small kind of attached mercenary unit to live with my pirate faction. And I could see that being something where I could buy a small amount of GW miniatures, not throw them several paychecks, and get to engage with the new miniatures. That's kind of where I would see myself living at best case. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
I think that is actually a fantastic segue, Reaver, into what I was going to go on to say about the aesthetics, right? Because to talk about the future of Chaos Dwarfs, the only other thing that we can really draw on is these hobgoblins. We know they have a relationship, so let's talk directly about the hobgoblins and their aesthetics. So we'll put some of the Warhammer community images up on the YouTube video, courtesy of Oxy's hard work. Do we want to just kind of jump into it and say what we think about the look and feel, and what works for us, what's different, what we like?
Yeah, let's do that. So let's have a look at the picture of the hobgoblins.
So here's the thing: these don't look like hobgoblins as we know them. They have obviously taken the concept of the hobgoblin, which is a medium-sized goblinoid who is stronger than a goblin but weaker than an orc. They've drawn on the long torsos of the 93 Scythian floppy hat range, which is an interesting aesthetic, and they have used that. Other than that, though, really what we're dealing with here is some unpleasant and cruel looking dudes, but the aesthetic comparison really ends there. Because what we are looking at is nudists wearing small amounts of plate armor, which is strapped together, covering the thigh and the center of the chest, and then very wicked looking spiked samurai / Mongol styled helmets. And I was looking for the name of what these Mongol styled helmets were, and I couldn't find one. So the style itself is not that distinct, but as we will go on to discuss, I think they look slightly more samurai than Mongol anyway. But the armor plates themselves are really interesting, because the armor plates have got these kind of, I don't want to call them nipples, but people on the forum have been calling them nipples. They've got these circles with bolts in them, and that all makes sense. But the issue is, this is very small amounts of armor, and it's tied together by quite large amounts of rope. So there is a bit of a bondage samurai aesthetic going on here. That it wasn't quite what I was expecting, I'll be honest. It's clearly a hobgoblin, and yet it's totally different from anything we've ever seen before.
Yeah, I completely agree on the Eastern vibes. That I definitely picked up on that as well, and that and rope honestly kind of plays into that a little bit with some kind of classical renditions of samurai aesthetics. But the helmets, completely agree. I can't put a finger on it, but it does have that. It does have that samurai look, and that actually kind of, like you said, segued there, because that's kind of what I was. If we're to bring this into a Chaos Dwarf realm, it actually is something that was more interesting than I would expect myself being out of it. Not necessarily from the hobgoblin perspective, but as to what that could portend.
And again, just to be explicit for everyone, we're not making this up. We're not being optimistic. We were told they get their weapons and armor from Dark Masters whose relationship with them goes back to the world that was. That means Chaos Dwarfs, which means that this arms and armor is the best indication of what that might look like, especially because none of the other Cruel Boys range really has any kit or equipment that looks much like this.
Do you know what's something though, which hasn't really been spoken about, because I might be completely off mark here? I'm seeing a slightly strange influence here as I'm looking at it. Now I'm looking at one of the goblins kind of singled out. His helmet with the spike on top of it, the grenade in his hand being a stick with a bomb on the end of it.
It's World War One.
That's a Picklehauser helmet and a World War One grenade, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it's an interesting one. It's the sides of the helmet that say samurai. The spike itself is also a reference to one of the 4 Ogla Khan's wolf boys, who wears a helmet that is, you know, kind of Far East styled with a pike at the top. But the grenades are like the new and interesting thing about the unit as the way that it fights, and again is something that we're told they get from the Chaos Dwarfs. And from that perspective, it does bring that kind of industrialized warfare element, which I do think that we would probably all agree we'd like to see in Chorf range when it comes.
Well, we were talking about the Great War when we were talking about the Legion of Asgore range. We were talking about the big guns and trains and all that kind of stuff in the First World War and in the Second World War and that as well. So I'm not saying that the Great War is a direct inspiration here, but the Great War is an image of war on an industrial scale, on industry bent towards war. And yet, isn't that just what Chaos Dwarfs are all about? Industry.
Yeah, absolutely agreed.
War. So maybe it's not a direct influence coming in there. Maybe it's a bit more of a subtle one. But then that could lead into what the Chaos Dwarfs look more like. Now, here's my hope for the Chaos Dwarfs, right? This armor is spiky and nasty and metal and industrial, and that's cool. Now, if the Chaos Dwarfs are kitted out in armor like that from head to toe, this could look really badass. Here, however, the Chaos Dwarfs are going down the kind of nudist with a little bit of armour approach. It might not be. Now, my hope is that these are their Hobgoblin lackeys and their slaves, so they will be less well equipped. Therefore, we can expect the dwarfs to be heavier armoured. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I mean, famously in World War One, the Kaiser's crack troops did fight almost completely naked, except for small amounts of body armor. So I think that might be a World War One influence that people haven't tapped onto either. How do we feel about the, for want of a better word, nudism and ropes? I mean, where are you guys at on that? Because I'm not feeling it. I'm going to be really honest with you.
I'm not sure. I don't have really any issues with it, to be honest. You know, I mean, greenskins, they're slaves to us, to Chaos Dwarfs. So it would be weird for them to be very dressed and armored anyway, in my headcanon. So yeah, it might be a bit weird to only have plate armor and some rope, but on the other hand, you know, you don't want to spend your finest clothing and finest armor on your slaves that will probably die pretty quickly. Just throwing away money anyway, so just give them some vital organ protection and stylish vital organ protection and send them out there. They'll probably blow themselves up anyway.
Yeah, and I do think that is a really good take on it, Michael, right? Like I can get behind that. I really can. I think for me personally, it's such a gap between the original aesthetic and this one that as a stylistic choice, the Hobgoblins didn't seem like sort of happy warriors, if you see what I'm saying. They're always betraying people. They're always sneaking around. They like to surround their enemies and get behind them. That's the original sneaky git aesthetic. And these guys are much more in your face, which I think, you know, good luck to them. They are greenskins, right? And they are hyping up that element of it. But they're not going to go with my other stuff because everyone else is wearing clothes.
Thing is,
because it was 5th edition.
These guys are not made to go with your stuff. These guys are made to
go
with new AOS, and even with old lore. This doesn't seem stupid from a Chaos Dwarf perspective because, you know, even in your own stories, you don't really want to put your back to a goblin, you know?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. I do think it works, but the more I look at it, like, I think the coolest thing about these guys is the heads. and I'll be interested, and like the hook hand, the really horrible looking knives. And I really, as Oxy says, I really want to see that aesthetic reflected in the Chaos Dwarf range when it finally comes.
Now, to be honest, if they would have some simple, cloth robing or some simple shirt and pants, they wouldn't look worse. I mean, it would make them not necessarily better, but they would still look the same for me. They would still have the same vibe, but they would fit better with whatever we all have. So I get where you're coming from.
I think an interesting thing here is, right, Age of Sigmar has generally been moving away from fantasy slowly. Right? Generally has been doing away with some of the tropes of unit formations. When you look at new models that are being brought out, a lot of things like standard bearers and musicians are disappearing. Now, standard bearers seem to be hanging about a bit more, but normally as special characters. Average box of troops now tends to be warriors with a champion. It's very interesting that these guys have this hornblower and this standard bearer as a normal part of their unit, which to those of us who play Warhammer Fantasy Battles, and you're looking at converting these into your units, that's one thing you don't have to do, isn't it? You actually have a standard bearer and a hornblower there already, which is quite nice.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So that, they haven't been completely wiped out, right? So Zangors have a standard bearer and a musician in them, for instance. And the musician's also playing a giant horn. And I wonder if what you're reaching for, Jack, is that maybe these are intended to be used in the fullness of time as kind of double count for the old world when it finally happens.
See, I was going to raise that point, but when I raised that point on my local gaming group, they all told me I was wrong, and it won't be.
I think the thing that is most interesting, because I tell you what, sculpts are definitely not being made to rank up on square bases easily. That's not being done. My personal guess is that if they've got any brains at all, the old world is going to use unit bases where you put your circular base troops onto a square frame rather than authentically square based individual models. But that's neither here nor there. The point is, they are definitely mortgaging a lot more of the old world IP by making this and bringing these guys out, and the Chaos Dwarfs are clearly going to do that again in future. And whether people decide to use them across both systems, I think that GW will probably be positive about that. And I definitely think that the inclusion of things like standard bearers and musicians, even in chaff units, it does move in that direction for me as well.
Yeah, definitely. I don't want to get too bogged down in base sizes and that either, but these guys might struggle to rank up perfectly on 20 mils. I think you could do it. Diagonally, I think you could do it. Be a bit of work maybe with that standard bearer. But maybe 25 mils square ends up being the standard for troopers, you're laughing with this troop here. But anyway, like I said, let's not get bogged down in base sizes because this is a game that hasn't even been announced yet. For all we know, it's 15mm scale. So
Yeah, well, I wanted to point out that we are all assuming they'll have the same base size as they have in 8th edition and whatever. But for all we know, they'll go on 25mm square bases, and in my opinion, they'll rank up pretty okay on 25mm bases. But then again, Oxy said, well, we don't want to get bogged down in bases, so I decided not to make that point.
Yeah.
yeah, it's hard, isn't it? Every time the old world gets mentioned, I always start a conversation with, well, let's not bother speculating because who knows what it's going to be. I mean, it's always about 2 or 3 hours of speculation, like just begins very.
Irresistible. It's irresistible.
And although I said I'm going to get bogged down about base sizes, here I am getting bogged down about base sizes. If 25mm ends up becoming the standard for the new game, that doesn't really matter to old gamers because you can get movement trays that put a little gap in between each model on your 20 mils. You won't even need to rebase. Rebasing is only ever harder when things need to be smaller than what they are. If things need to be bigger than what they are, there are always workarounds. There are always things you can do to convert things and put things in movement trays.
That's what I think.
Yeah, because the scale's gone up so much. 20mm doesn't hold what it used to, does it? But anyway, I think we should move away.
Yeah, Reaver was going to rescue us, but we can't.
Rescuing you by just still processing something that Chit said earlier. In terms of why, and I agree, and I think they don't particularly fit with classically these hobgoblins, I wouldn't want to fit them in my army. And I think one of the first things that I was looking at in parallels, first saw these, like, okay, so we have some new like sneaky gits, yet we're wearing clanky armor and throwing grenades, and that might have been a little bit of a disconnect for me. Granted, yeah, they're not necessarily just sneaky gits anymore, but just in terms of the unit name and kind of what I thought first looking at them with kind of the knives and everything. But yeah, and now I'm kind of just processing that a bit more, and now I'm seeing this is a very noisy unit. These are not sneaking around, so there's a little bit of like we're trying to sneak around, but also we're just tossing grenades everywhere. So it's an interesting choice, and it fits AOS well. It's just something that I don't necessarily see this jiving for me.
Sneaky Gits were flavorful, right? They were much more flavorful than any other of the old Hobgoblin Scythian hat range, ultimately, right? And that's why what we're seeing is basically these guys, and then we'll probably get some Hobgoblins on Wolves as a kind of callback to Oglikon. And fine, that's good. I think that makes sense because they are trying to take the most flavorful things, and some dudes with bows and some dudes with axes wearing a funny hat from 2,000 years ago is not that flavorful compared to like, oh, they're crafty and sneaky and they got big knives, right? So I'm with them that far that these guys should be knife wielding psychos. But quite how, how they relate to it. Really, they've taken cruelty as the thing that they've done, right? And they've given them horrible, evil-looking grins, and like these guys clearly enjoy the infliction of pain, and that's why they fight with the Cruel Boys as a faction, who are clearly guys who take a lot of joy in shivving you. Arguably, the Sneaky Gits are the unit that was used as inspiration not just for this regiment, but for the entire Cruel Boys range, because it's all about being vindictive. It's all about being dastardly and going above and beyond what's acceptable to really do horrible things to your enemy. And that's why the knives look as distinctive as they do. That's why they use scrap grenades, and they've got all sorts of other things. There's a bolt thrower in this range included as well.
Yeah, a couple of points I want to pick up on there actually. It's first of all the grenades, right? For the Warhammer purist who wants to run these as sneaky gits, you are very fortunate that they have chosen a World War I style grenade for this with a handle. And if you have a look at the bottom of the handle, it has the same diamond shaped kind of bottom parts to the blades as well. This is a very easy conversion to turn these into two knife wielding hobgoblins. All you need is little spear tips, little blades, and you can easily do that. The only sculpt that's sticking out at me as being a little bit more difficult with that is maybe the guy who's throwing it forward. But hey, if you want to go crazy and have one who's lobbing a blade at someone, I think that could still work as well. So I do think that these are very convertible to be sneaky gits, albeit sneaky gits with a very new aesthetic. Okay, sneaky gits that don't look like you kind of Scythian floppy hat.
Yeah, that's interesting because I actually land where I like the grenades. I like that choice. And so this is where I land in sheer confusion, because I actually I appreciate the grenades and I want to keep them. That is something where I could definitely see it fits with Chaos Dwarfs. That fits with my aesthetic, I think, as well. So yeah, so I'm coming in a dire state of confusion on these, I guess is the story.
I'm buying them, and I the nudism bothers me, but I'm buying them, and I'm going to end up buying the Wolf Riders as well. By the way, we expect from a reputable source that there will be Wolf Riders who are Hobgrotz as well.
The source was so good that we basically knew about this before it was coming out. We won't give you any more details than that, but let's just say they've been on the money already. So I would fully expect Wolf Riders to be out soon.
And we're gonna collab with some interesting people later this year as well, if we can get away with it. I had just one more thing to say on these, and I don't know whether you guys, I've skipped anything over, but like, there's two options for what's going to happen with these guys, right? Option one, you're going to be able to take these as a battle line troops choice in the future Chaos Dwarf army, and it will be the first time that we've seen greenskins fighting in a Chaos army since Big Hats. Option two, the Chaos Dwarfs are going to actually not be Chaos Dwarfs, they're going to be Destruction Dwarfs. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts is that, right, were Chaos Dwarfs, as in the Chaos Dwarfs of Zarnagrund, were Chaos Dwarfs ever really Chaos Dwarfs? These guys worship an entity outside of the big chaos entities, about the chaos gods. They carry on warfare in a very different way to their Norscan, not even allies, people who they occasionally work with or supply armor to. They were this faction has been evil dwarfs over chaos dwarfs every single time. The things that define this faction is that they are dwarfs and that they are evil. They aren't even chaotic. They are organized in the extreme. These aren't anarchists. These are planners and builders and industrialists. So I don't think that chaos dwarfs need to be, or evil dwarfs that may replace them, need to be wedded to the idea of chaos. However, chaos dwarfs being a destruction faction, does that work either? Because from what I understand, destruction's main aims is the complete annihilation of civilization and governments and organization and all that kind of stuff. This new giant teddy bear centaur apparently is the king of killing kings and killing cities and bringing all that stuff down. I can't see chaos dwarfs allying themselves with that worldview either. The other reason, though, why they might have to be, I'm going on the other side now, the other reason why they might have to be destruction is, have we ever had units that can ally with each other in Age of Sigmar that are from different grand alliances? I don't know, but I don't think so. So I don't think there's ever been an example where there is a chaos unit or chaos army who can take a unit of destruction models within its own faction. Sorry, quite a lot there.
And greenskins have historically been considered immune to chaos, right? Outside of old 80s lore tidbits around the edges.
Yeah.
So you can't argue that, like, if you field Hobgrotz in your Zarvixa force or whatever the Chaos Dwarfs end up being, that they, like, actually are chaos units. Look, I think you may not be allowed to pick Hobgrotz. I think the Chaos Dwarfs will be Chaos Dwarfs because dwarfs hate orcs, and so you can't put them in Grand Alliance destruction. And also for the things that you've said, Oxy, about, like, they build stuff which goes against the whole aesthetic of destruction, which is, I just put on this bear skin and now I'm going to kill you. But I don't know if you'll necessarily be allowed to keep the Hobgrotz, or whether that'll just be kind of a fluff thing, and you won't be able to field them. You'll just be fielding your chorfs.
I mean, it could be like, if you look at AOS and what happened with the world and stuff like that, that they just, even what they said with the release, that they choose to separate Hobgrotz or Hobgoblins and Chaos Dwarfs, and that they're like maybe still dealing with them, but not really in the same army, or even not dealing directly with Chaos Dwarfs, but intermediates or something like that, to separate the two armies. I can see that happening, actually.
I definitely think that what you're dealing with is Chaos Dwarfs who, because they don't worship the main four, are on the outer edge of the Chaos Alliance, as it were, right? They're out there on the kind of, we're too cool for this shit. We'll sell guns to greenskins if it pays the bills. Do you know what I mean? So it may be that the Chaos Dwarfs are the least chaosy of the Chaos factions, and then the whatever they're called, Cruel Boys, are the most chaosy of the destruction factions. But in practice, if a unit is a unit of slaves who are fighting to some extent without their consent, then who says they can't put them over the edge and have you being able to choose Hobgrotz as a troop's choice in your Chaos Force?
Well, there was nothing stopping them having the same war scroll twice. One called Cruel Boy Hobgrotz, one called Zarvixa or whatever it is, Hobgrotz, and one having the destruction keyword and one having the chaos keyword, and then being in both army books. There is literally nothing stopping them from doing that.
But I wonder, my personal instinct is that the aesthetic and then the thematic connection is the only connection that you're going to get. And on the tabletop, they're going to have no shortage of Chaos Dwarfs for you to buy and field.
Still, it'll give people on our forum an awful lot to play with in terms of if there was a lot of new Hobgrotz coming out, and then later on in a year or so, a lot of new Chaos Dwarfs coming out. It gives the people on the forum a lot to play with in terms of creating new armies for systems that would allow you to take a Chaos Dwarf Hobgrot alliance.
So really what we're saying is, I'm not going to be able to stop buying miniatures anytime soon.
that's not going to happen anyway, mate. You sold your soul the moment you got involved in Games Workshop hobby.
Nightmare. Anything else we want to talk about Cruel Boys related? Does anyone want to talk about any of the other stuff in the range that they saw? Maybe is interesting, maybe for conversion.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to talk about the actual Cruel Boys themselves, the orcs. That is maybe slightly off topic on a Chaos Dwarf podcast, but not completely, because our faction enslaves orcs and uses orcs, so these models may well still be of interest to collectors of Chaos Dwarfs. Now, my expectations going into this release were rock bottom. I had no real expectations of what I was or wasn't going to see, or how excited I was for it, or anything like that. As I say, I feel like I've been bitten a couple of times with Age of Sigmar releases, but I was so impressed with the greenskin range here. We've already talked about the Hobgrotz, and I like them a lot, but these new orcs as well have just absolutely wowed me. I'm really into them. And in terms of old school Warhammer fans, I might be in a minority here, because from one perspective, these are very Age of Sigmar models. They're poses and all that. But these, to me, are what I consider real orcs. Now, I'm actually going to share. I'm going to share the link to the blog that I shared to you guys about a week ago underneath this podcast. The campaign for real orcs. Now, this is a this is a blog I read. A friend of mine sent it to me a couple of years ago when I was first moaning about orcs. And he said this guy, I think he's a teacher, and he was doing a Dungeons and Dragons club or a Warhammer club or whatever. And he said to these kids, right, there are these orcs, and these kids didn't know what orcs were. So he jumped on Google Images and searched orcs, and he was utterly shocked and horrified by what came up, because what came up were World of Warcraft orcs, Dungeons and Dragons half-orc paladins, and all these other kinds of orcs that were
Noble savages.
Noble savages, Klingons, green Klingons. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and we're talking about next gen Klingons as well, not original series Klingons who were assholes.
No, absolutely. Next gen Klingons, the noble savage, the honourable warrior, that whole stereotype of things. And to a large extent, the Ard boys in Age of Sigmar have gone down this route. We've lost some of the comedy of the orcs, and we've been left with just the kind of the martial, serious, big, strong orc image. Now, the campaign for real orcs is a bit of a joke campaign, but it's got a real message where it's just talking about how in Tolkien's fantasy and early Dungeons & Dragons and early Warhammer, orcs are the lowest of the low. They are scum. They are backstabbing, sneaky, nasty, self-serving, vindictive, vicious little creatures. Creatures who like violence, who like fighting, but only when the odds are in their favour, because they're utter cowards as well. You catch one of these things on their own and they're outnumbered, they'll peg it, but they'll go and get their mates and they'll find you on your own and they'll beat you up for fun. Like, in my mind, orcs have always, and maybe it's for Tolkien influence more than anything, they have always been the ubiquitous henchman for greater evil. You've got some nasty wizard somewhere, you've got some dark lord somewhere, you've got some greater evil somewhere. These are the little scumbags he sends out to do his bidding. Now, as controversial as it might be, the Warhammer Fantasy Orc, for me, hasn't really done that for me for a long time. Orcs over the years have kind of evolved into hulking great green gorillas of creatures. Now, in Warhammer 40,000, I actually quite like that aesthetic. The big Mad Max kitted out, giant green gorillas in space, they look like aliens, it works. But in fantasy, I always felt like we were missing that kind of nasty, skulking little orc. And I feel like we've got that here. These things are kind of lanky and thin, and they look vicious. Their weapons look like they are not just designed to kill, they're designed to hurt. And I've also posted up, guys, and I'll post this on the YouTube video as well, a copy of one of the very old Ravening Hordes books for Warhammer, and a copy of the very old Warhammer Armies books. Now, I'm not sure if these are orcs or hobgoblins being portrayed here. I think they're orcs, I'm not sure. But have a look at them. And I do feel like these new models have somewhat recaptured that earlier spirit of orcs. I've blabbered on a lot there for a love letter for these new models. Do you guys want to tell me why I'm wrong now?
So here's the thing. First of all, just for cultural reference, especially for those not from the UK, the Campaign for Real Orcs is a pun on the Campaign for Real Ale, which was like a pressure group that wanted less manufactured beer in the UK and was very famous on that basis. But look, I think you're spot on, Oxy, right? Because the thing that has been missing from orcs for a long time is that orcs ceased to be the nastiest people in the setting. Because in Tolkien, orcs are the nastiest thing that you can encounter, right? Other than like a giant spider that wants to eat you. Whereas in GW's works, originally, orcs were the main villain of a lot of the stories that they told. But then over time, they realized this was all about humans and it was all about chaos and the corrupting influence on man. And chaos became the nastiest thing that could happen to you that went bump in the night. And the orcs were just like football hooligans from the 1980s chanting, here we go, here we go, here we go. And there was something wholesome about the fact that they liked fighting and they wanted to fight. Whereas these guys, in the form of the Cruel Boys, they don't want to get up close to you unless they have to. They'll shiv you, they'll throw a grenade at you, they will hurt you, their weapons are designed to cause pain. That is a real reassertion of why you don't want to encounter an orc. Because they are vile creatures, again, for the first time. There's nothing enjoyable, you know what I mean? It doesn't look like the Cruel Boys get on with each other, let alone enjoy fighting. They're here to do damage. And that's what you see on that Warhammer Armies book with the evil red eyes and all that kind of stuff. Those are the big bad villains of that story that you're looking at. And orcs haven't had that resonance for a long time, but I feel like they're finally getting it back.
Yeah, I have nothing to add to that.
In that case, are we all going to buy the bolt thrower, which has giant log-sized spears on it? Because I definitely am. It's going to be a Hobgoblin bolt thrower of the old school. It'll sit right next to my 1993 one.
I want the infantry, right? I want the Hobgrotz en masse. I want the Cruel Boys en masse. The bolt thrower, I'm not sold on yet, and the crossbowman, I'm not sold on yet. But I know that in my square-based Norscan Chaos Dwarf army, those Hobgrotz have a place. Now, I can see Reaver's point. With his army, those hand grenades are going to fit beautifully. With my army, I think a second knife or a little shield might fit a little bit better for them. But the Cruel Boys, I think, are going to be very cool orc slaves as well for mine. They're going to be skinnier than most people's orcs, and they're kind of wearing rags and stuff already. So that's what I'm going to be getting, I think.
Any other last thoughts about the range, what we think of it, what we feel about it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't see myself... I don't think I'll get the Dominion box. The miniature that I like the best is the tiny little...
He's a gladiator, isn't he? He looks like a little gladiator.
Yeah,
almost like a snotling dude with a full plate helmet with some nice teeth and a visor. Yeah, that's such a fun little model. I could sneak that in to pretty much anything. Yeah, unit of he could fall into place pretty much anywhere. So I like that model, but I don't think it's enough to really pull me in any direction on these guys. One thing I would say is if they do come out with, for example, like what is it? Underworlds. If they come out with an Underworlds box of like 4 or 5 of these guys, that's a level that I would definitely engage with this faction. I think in terms of it was a little combination of some Cruel Boys and maybe a Hobgrotz and one of these little snotling dudes. That'd be best case. That sounds like it'd be a lot of fun. I do like how they look. Yeah, completely agree with your comments on the aesthetic. The banner dude, especially, kind of that so much cruelty right there in one model. He's got a very Azog looking face. Yeah, there's lots of cool stuff in here. I don't barring me getting into AOS, probably won't go for them holistically, but there's some fun little pieces in there for sure.
And the Tolkien reference is worth meditating on for a second, right? Because these orcs are definitely the post Shadow of Mordor orcs. And if you guys haven't played Shadow of Mordor, it's basically a Lord of the Rings set action RPG game where the orcs are the star of the show, and they are the classic orcs that Oxy is describing. They are sniveling, cowardly, sadistic. They have those Lord of the Rings orcs aesthetics. And that's why I think you're seeing with the Cruel Boys different physical proportions. I think you're also seeing some Lord of the Rings influence coming through in the helmets, the spikes, the role that spiky helmets are playing. But then most importantly of all, the war boss for these guys is on a warg. And I don't care what they're going to call it. It's a classic Lord of the Rings warg.
Yeah, absolutely. It's another thing that's probably a massive faux pas to Warhammer fans, but in my head, orcs ride giant wolves, they don't ride pigs. And I don't get me wrong, I like those old armies. I've got the 6th edition rulebook behind me, and there are some gorgeous images of fully painted, beefy orcs riding pigs and stuff. It's cool. But in my head canon, if I was creating a universe, orcs would ride giant wolves. They're just nastier creatures, and I think it makes more sense.
Yeah, what you said about the helmets was spot on too. I mean, probably one of my least favorite units in the box, but the giant arbalest Cruel Boys, the helmets that they have are very, very reminiscent of kind of Tolkien-y orcs. I really like the helmets and heads on those actually, so I'd be interested to see what that kit looks like. But I could see them being very integral, unfortunately. But those are some cool helmets for sure. They look very malicious. Yeah, not into the unit as a whole, but there's cool parts of it.
The shields, how do we feel about the shields? Because for me, the shields are a real. If we're talking about how this is a bunch of Tolkien,
It's
orcs,
Oldhammer.
the shields make this instantly Games Workshop, don't they? Because that absolutely, it's that red leering face. I think it's called the Evil Sun in 40k. I don't know if it's called the same thing in fantasy. It used to be on the side of paint pots and spray cans, didn't it?
Yeah,
that's classic
they've
Oldhammer.
just published a Warhammer community article that goes into the aesthetic a little bit more detail and shows some of the Oldhammer Evil Sun stuff that inspired it directly. And I do think that it was something that was sad that it was dropped from the aesthetic, and I am glad that it's back. Just because the way that GW is mortgaging some of the old IP is really positive, unless you're a High Elves player. And in that context, these shields, I wouldn't be surprised, Oxy, honestly, if you get your hands on the greenskin half of the Dominion box, which I know is your plan, I wouldn't be surprised if those shields look good on your Hobgoblins in place of those grenades. They're a bit big.
Yeah, I mean, I thought they are quite big, but I can see them being used on lots and lots of different things. And yeah, I think for personal use and personal use only, the blue stuff and the green stuff might be coming out there, Chits.
Speaking of which, fans of my economic situation will be aware that I am currently resisting the urge to buy the Dominion box solely to get the Hobgoblins and the 2 Grots. And I think, Reaver, you're in the same boat with me of like loving that little gladiator grot so much that you're like almost a bit like, could I make use of the rest of the box? And the answer is no.
Yeah, no, that's gone through my head, certainly.
I'm going to have to wait, and it's going to take ages, and I may not be able to get him, but as you were implying, Oxy, I'm sure that I'll be able to find someone who is willing to sell me the tiny gladiator grot on its own, eventually, in the fullness of time. Yeah.
There's always ways around this thing, yeah. Even if it is having to, God forbid, deal with an evil eBay scalper, there are better options for that. Hopefully not that one, but there will always be a way to find a single model.
Speaking of which, I've almost sold out of my Dogs of War on eBay, so if you want Leopold's Leopard Company, get on eBay now. They're the lowest price.
Oh wow, nice one. There you go. Right, cool. Oh, I think is that just about everything we had planned to talk about with Dominion there, gentlemen?
Absolutely.
Nice one. So I think we're going to be moving on very, very swiftly to a completely different subject. Kdaii Fireborn. Now, Kdaii Fireborn were not a model that was represented in the lore or the miniature range when Chaos Dwarfs were about in the 80s. They weren't in the lore or the model range when Chaos Dwarf big hats were given to us in the 1990s. This is very much a 2000s part of the Chaos Dwarf range that came out with the Forge World release. Now, I'm not completely up to scratch in my lore on this. Chits, you might be a better person to talk about this because you tend to know the ins and outs of things with all things Chaos Dwarf in terms of lore and background. would you maybe be able to tell us a little bit about what exactly a Kdaii is? Because I believe I know in broad strokes, but you might know in a bit more detail.
Absolutely. So, Kdaii Fireborn are not part of the original 90s concept, right? Because the original 90s concept was a pretty straight down the line army. It didn't feature demons. You may remember in Warhammer Fantasy Battle, back in those days, unless you were fielding demons as an army, which you couldn't at first, demons had to be summoned onto the board, which was quite difficult. And as a result, that was a game mechanic that was confined to only a few factions. So Kdaii Fireborn come to us in Tamarkan, the Throne of Chaos, which is the supplement that launches the Legion of Asgore range. And in that context, it's super simple. Basically, priests of Hashut enslave demons they summon by binding them into weapons, armor, war machines, constructs, harnessing and controlling the demons so that they have a clear physical form that is permanent, right? Because otherwise, if you summon a demon on its own, it starts to degrade the longer it spends time in reality. This is why Kdaii Fireborn are defined by essentially being suits of armor possessed by molten metal and fire, and often trailing chains and other motifs of Hashut. And then obviously that armor and chains, gets warped by the demonic presence. They grow claws, but the claws are made of molten steel. It's that kind of thing, right? So Kdaii are supposed to be almost mindless elemental forces of destruction, and they have a very distinctive visual aspect that combines fire and flame with armor and metal.
You talking about the binding of demons there being put to work in different places just makes me think, the Kdaii think they're having a tough time. Imagine being the poor one who's been summoned and turned into an arse cannon. It can always be worse, can't it? It can always be worse. Makes me think there could be like a little Flintstone style cutaway, where the Kdaii is moaning about it and then it turns around to the arse cannon and is like, and I thought my job was a pain in the ass, that sort of thing.
There is no lore background or provenance for an arse cannon, so it's not 100% clear how you make one, and I do not intend to address that in any of my fiction. So, answers on a postcard through to the off-topic, please, gentlemen.
Badly behaved Kdaii, that's the punishment they get. So, for the listeners at home, we'll put up on screen what the Kdaii looks like on the old Forge World range, and for those of you who can't see on screen, if you imagine any kind of thoughts of what a fire or lava elemental from other properties like Dungeons and Dragons and stuff, if you're thinking along those lines, you're thinking of something similar. Imagine a fire elemental with a suit of armor, fire elemental with kind of chest and head armor with kind of fiery hands and claws sort of coming out. Now, we were prepared to talk about Kdaii today because it's one of those models that with the Forge World range now gone, we'd like to discuss really what can people do to get Kdaii in their lives. I mean, you can always get the second hand. You can get the old Kdaii Fireborn, definitely. But we'd be interested if there are conversion ideas or if there are other companies that are selling things. I've found a few companies that sell models that really work with this. Michael, I think you've found some cool 3D files that people can download and print. And Reaver, you've created some Kdaii Fireborn for your army. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about how you went about that? And we can flash up, for those who are on YouTube, we can flash up on the screen Reaver's models while he discusses this.
Sure thing, yeah. And one thing you mentioned earlier in our last conversation that kind of rings into this conversation a bit for me, at least, and talking about the Chaos Dwarfs as something aligned with chaos, and to me, as a departure from the regular dwarfs, it's the magic and kind of these unfettered demon binding operations that they go about. That's what brings Chaos Dwarfs into, say, at least close to the realm of chaos, as opposed to thinking about the function of their society and other aspects that are still very organized. But to me, something that I wanted to have in an army, and something that I feel like if my Reavers were pulling up to a shore, they would just be like, all right, let's just release this enfilade to get things started. And I think I think that really brings the chaos into this faction. So it's definitely something that I wanted to include. And to be honest, I was never fully anticipating owning any Forge World models. I do like them per se. I mean, there's just such a wealth, and we'll get into this, but a wealth of conversion opportunities, scratch builds, other lines of miniatures that you can directly pull from. So I was never really hell bent on getting the actual Forge World models, but well, happenstance and good fortune of getting a used set of 6, and they come in a set of 3. So and they have a decent amount of variability, but not over much. There's only 3 heads, so definitely wanted to take those and make something distinct. And since they only have so many different poses and the flame patterns are a little distinctive, so wanted to put some effort into making distinctive weapons and creating my own heads or converting the heads for the remainder. So I only used the classic heads once, but. So kind of started with that. Most of the extra bits were robbed from various Chaos Warriors sets. I believe chains and kind of flails from one of the chariots, I believe, in the Chaos range. Some other bits taken from that, and a little bit pulled in from Fire Slayer's bits actually. So there's some of those poking in as well. But for the most part, they're pretty much right from Forge World with some swaps and some heads and one of Fugat's nice hats. So yeah, couldn't resist the man burner. I believe it's the man burner, the unit leader. Could be wrong on that. Might be thinking of a fan army book, but yeah, wanted to give him the nice hat and make him a little distinctive. But anyway, it's just they're a fun unit. There's definitely plenty of other options. And some of the ones that when I was coming into Chaos Dwarfs that I'd seen the most would be Chubb's blog and the various ways that he's gone and tackled Fireborn, or more so just in general this idea of this 40 millimeter base sized golem that is in some way demonically possessed, and he's tackled it in a ton of different ways, and even some I believe at his smaller scale. I could be wrong on that, but a lot of great inspiration, and I'm sure we'll provide a link to that so everybody can go take a look. And they're ranging all from taking more Minotaur kits and embellishing with green stuff to make them look more like lava, to something more scratch built from I guess it's like clump foliage, I guess would be how I would describe it. I'm not sure if anybody has a better word for that or what it might be called elsewhere, but I would see that as more like a sponge kind of thing where you can apply super glue, and a lot of people use that for firing plumes from barrels. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And see people doing that a lot, and I think Chubb had even done a destroyer-sized model with the classic, thumbtack hat kind of deal. So there's lots of different ways to accomplish this, and I think that really speaks to the variety of the unit. And we'll have a bunch of pictures here, and there's really no two that are very alike. And there's certainly themes that go through it, but and I agree with what I've heard people say in terms of like it being a relatively uninspiring if you're just looking at like your classic D&D style, fire elemental. But I think there's lots of fun directions that people have taken this, and kind of speaks to kind of an open format, and I guess that's kind of why I enjoyed the unit.
Yeah, I get what you mean. They are definitely they're open to interpretation, aren't they? It's a fire demon or a demon in the form of fire that's been enslaved, and you can go what direction you like that. Now, one of my main criticisms of the Forge World designs in the past has been they kind of lacked a personality as such. They kind of just they didn't really inspire me. But what I really like about yours is the addition of this champion, who is absolutely oozing in personality. Where you've given him like a Chaos Dwarf style big hat, and you've even created like a beard style thing using chains all around him, reposing him so he's holding that great big halberd up in the air and stuff. So I really like what you've done with that, Reaver, because you've injected a lot of personality into a model which is it could, if not done correctly, be quite dull, but you've made it very exciting and very interesting. You've made it very alive. I like that.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, he's the most divergent, obviously, from the classic Forge World one. Put the most work into that, but yeah, I mean, that was definitely one of the goals. Was got to sneak a beard in here somehow. Chains is a huge motif on Kdaii in general, so it's like chain beard. The hat had to happen, and I actually tried to sneak in a tiny mustache as well, in terms of the on the helmet, make it a little ornate.
Yeah.
It's not incredibly explicit. You could also kind of interpret it as horns, but depends.
I hadn't picked up on it, but now I'm looking at it, I can see that. Yeah, no, it's great stuff. It's great stuff. And as you say about stuff that Chubb's done before, he always thinks outside the box with his conversions, doesn't he? And the ones that really inspire me are his small scale ones that are kind of like lava rock elemental things, which would take the place of Kdaii. He's created them just using blocks, hasn't he?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, they look fantastic. And I think they have great personality to it. He's created a palanquin version as well as what looks like could be like an altar of Hashut kind of deal. But yeah, with these kind of blocky bull horns, I feel like they really, yeah. If I were to go for that scale, I'd certainly be trying to replicate something like that because they really work.
Thing that I've seen people do some interesting things just using sprues and stuff before. It opens up possibilities for even using waste products from your hobby, turning them into something quite artistic.
Yeah, off topic, but that's certainly something I've enjoyed doing in the past. I made obsidian golems for the Tomb Kings in the past, and mostly sprue and leftover bits, but about 80% sprue glued onto a wireframe. Can be a really fun project. Kind of sequestered myself without any real bits and just set to carving up sprue.
Forces creativity, and it makes you feel like you're winning. This is waste material that would have gone into the bin. I've just turned it into a unit for my army. I've won.
Absolutely, and I think the last thing here that I wanted to bring up on Admiralty Miniatures on the Etsy page, the Storm Demons or Shadow Demons, and I feel like and I kind of have pulled from that inspiration in other aspects. That last Golden Hat competition, and one of my other sorcerers who kind of weaves ash magic. But this is another whole way you could spin this general idea of demons that are bound in service of a sorcerer. This kind of shadow ash or storm demon. I feel like that could very much fall right into somebody's Chaos Dwarf army very easily.
Definitely. I've got a couple of things prepared to talk about, which are more kind of commercially available models right now that people might be able to use to create some kind of. The first I came up with is a model that comes from the Fire Slayer's Endless Spells for Age of Sigmar. I don't actually know the name of this spell.
It's called the Molten Infernoth, because of course it is.
Of course, why wouldn't it be called a Molten Inferno? Bloody hell, Age of Sigmar.
One of three magmic invocations, right?
Yeah, not even endless spells.
Not even endless spells, magmic invocations. You know what?
Yeah.
It's like they swallow a thesaurus when they come out with these. It's up on the screen now, though. So for those of you who don't know, one of their endless spells is like a giant magma demon dragon thing pulling itself out of the ground, covered in spikes, and it's completely made out of lava or molten metal or something. And I think it could work really well in a Chaos Dwarf army as a fire demon. It's probably one of the better models from the Games Workshop range in terms of fulfilling that role right now. Only thing about this model that one might struggle with is this is the only model of its kind in the game. If you want to get extra poses out of that to create a unit of things out of this, you're going to have quite a tough time in order to do it. That's the only thing I can see with that. If you wanted a single demon, I think the Fire Slayer Endless Spells could work quite well. Now, if people are interested in getting a kind of generic fire elemental model, the options are much, much wider, because games like Dungeons and Dragons have meant that people have been wanting to buy these miniatures for an awful long time, so that they're available. Reaper miniatures, for example, does a large fire elemental, which would fit the bill for a Kdaii completely. It's a giant fire demon with arms and head. The only thing it's lacking is armor, but it could still definitely work as a very suitable proxy. But again, the problem with relying on models from an RPG range is similar to this Games Workshop model, in that in an RPG you might summon one fire elemental or come up against one fire elemental. Very rarely are you going to come up against 6 fire elementals, all in different poses. So these companies very rarely will sell multiple poses of the same thing. And the problem I find with fire is you can feasibly have 6 soldiers all standing in a rank and looking basically the same, but having 6 fires all in a rank looking the same, that repetitive flame motif is going to really show, and you're going to see that repetition, and your brain's going to say there's something not quite right with that. However, Mantic Games, interestingly, does in there, and it's not in their Abyssal Dwarf range, it's in their Forces of Nature range, do sell fire elementals, and they come in 3 different poses. They're very, very similar to a Dungeons and Dragons fire elemental. They're almost like a Casper the Friendly Ghost shaped with a little tail, hands, and a head. So using those models, you could get at least 3 different poses of Kdaii into your army. It's 20 quid for free as well, so it's not super cheap, but it's not super expensive as well. It's quite affordable, really. And they do have a model which I think probably fits the Chaos Dwarf aesthetic a bit more and could maybe work well as a champion for a unit of these, which is their Greater Fire Elemental, which to me looks a bit more fitting with our Chaos Dwarf aesthetic. It's a kind of flame ghost once again, but this time it's a flame ghost with kind of spiky pieces of obsidian kind of jutting out of its shoulders and hands that end in claws made out of rock as well. Now, I think Chitz a little while ago said that something that Mantic Games also brought to the Chaos Dwarf range, which we didn't really have before, was the motif of fire and rock and lava, that sort of idea. The old big hats were often just shown on goblin green bases as things were in those days. It wasn't until much later on that Mantic Games started showing us to kind of fire demons and rock demons, lava being a big part of what makes an evil dwarf an evil dwarf. So they do have in the Abyssal Dwarf range, I suppose, a close fit for Kdaii. Not exactly the same. These are obsidian golems. Now, these creatures are portrayed as being made out of rock with kind of burning veins of lava between the cracks. But in terms of being suits of armor with demons inhabiting them, they absolutely fit the bill. Now, these things look a lot more like kind of hulking monsters of rock and metal, great big fists. But I'm actually, I'm quite into these models. I think they're really quite cool. The only issue I can see with them again might be the issue of repetitiveness, where it looks like there are 3 heads available and 2 poses available. So if you've got any more than 3 of these in a unit, you're going to start seeing the repeated poses. This is something I noticed quite a lot with Mantic Games is larger models. They're kind of ogre-sized or greater models. Is that they often have really nice sculpts, but not an awful lot of them. They'll have 2 different ice yetis, but when you've got a unit of 20 of those, you'll see that same model repeated an awful lot. But they do have some other ones as well. They have the Greater Obsidian Golem, which is the exact same idea, just on a bigger scale. Now, the Obsidian Golem's cool. It's a giant rock fire demon thing. It has great big metal shoulder pads, metal helmet, very chaosy. It's got big black rocks and spikes coming out of its back. I would argue, however, it does veer a little bit more than the smaller ones into a bit of a cartoony sort of area. So the Abyssal Greater Obsidian Golem is a cool model, but if you're going for a very grimdark aesthetic, this might not fit as well. It almost has a bit of a Skylanders sort of look. I think if this thing was standing next to 1990s big hats and all their cartoonish glory, it could work really quite well. Standing next to Legion of Asgore, it might not work quite as well. Just doing a little bit too cartoony for that range in particular. They have their they have another version of this model for their Vanguard system, their kind of their skirmish game, however, which really fits the bill as far as a Chaos Dwarf Magma Fire Demon goes. It's less cartoony than the previous one I spoke about. The one that they use in Vanguard is much more chaosy. It's got a great big metal horned helmet. It's got kind of lava pouring out of its feet. It looks nasty. It looks angry. And one of its hands ends in a giant lava gun, which is so Chaos Dwarf. It's absolutely fantastic. Another game company that has recently been creating models that could fit the bill for a Kdaii Fireborn is TT Combat. So yeah, this next one I was going to talk about was from Troll Trader, from TT Combat. Now you might know Troll Trader from eBay. It's been around for a long time, selling second-hand miniatures. Then branched out into doing TT Combat scenery, really affordable MDF stuff. A couple of mates have used it for Mordheim and for Necromunda. I can fully recommend it. And more recently, been doing miniatures as well. Haven't actually bought the miniatures, so can't attest to their quality, but the pictures look quite nice. So what we have here are fire elementals from TT Combat. And it's interesting. Often fire elementals are shown as being kind of ghosts. They have kind of like a wispy end to their body, a bit like a genie or something like that. Whereas 2 out of the 3 sculpts here have explicitly been given legs and they're walking forward. And there are rocks jutting out from these fire elementals to kind of take the place of hands or shoulders or a head here and there. And all 3 of them look very individual, which is really quite nice. And I'm quite a fan of these models. I really am. But it's going to be the same criticism that I've had for essentially every range of fire elementals I've looked at. And this does include the Forge World range as well. It's a very hard model, fire creatures, to get right when you are having a rank of 6 of them, for example, because the repetition's always just so obvious. You know, once you've seen those 3 sculpts, once you've seen those 3 positions, and then when you have 6 or 9 or 12 of these, and you see it over and over again, with something that's not made out of fire, that can work. Monsters can be standing in the same position, but flames can't be standing in the same position. So it's a very hard one to get right. I suppose one could, depending on how scale works on these, use different ranges and mash them together. A lot of these fire elementals are generic enough that they would work together in units as all being different. And scale isn't so much for consideration when what you're dealing with is some kind of spirit or demon. It doesn't particularly matter too much. I think they were the main ones that I found on my travels across the internet, actually. Who else has got some? Michael, have you managed to find any Kdaii Fireborn proxies in your ever-expanding library of STLs?
I did. Well, to be honest, I figured it was Kdaii in general, so I didn't really get Fireborn specifically. So there's also some proxies that I would have used for destroyers more specifically, but
Works as well. Yeah.
Yeah, I assumed that since, for example, as mentioned before, Chubb's proxies they go all over the place, and that works fine. So why wouldn't these? The first one I wanted to discuss are some Titan Forge miniatures. A while ago, maybe a year ago or something, they released the Sons of Kashanvra dwarfs. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And they are, well, somewhat. They're not specifically Chaos Dwarfy, but they are very mechanical. They use a lot of bolted armor and stuff like that. and they had some interesting models. A lot of those ended up in my armies, like the blunderbuss unit. It's from the same range. But they also had some bigger models, which in my head didn't really fit. I felt that they did. The hunching, I mean, Chaos Dwarf with his head more between his shoulders than like standing. The ones I sent are, I forgot what they're called, but they're and you have two options. One with a sort of forged head helmet. They don't have a lot of flames specifically. You know, there are some rocks sprouting out of rock or something. They could just be from one of their factories and be, well, you know, fit pretty well in an army. And taking that bridge from what I said earlier about fitting with older armies, the next one is from the same range. I forgot their name, but they are a little bit smaller than the golems I just shown. But the same principle applies, and they, funnily enough, have the same chain beards as Reaver's model. So that's, I didn't see that before, but that's a funny coincidence. But the same rules apply here. They're mechanical, well, suits of armor. More or less. Well, I don't see them as suits of armor because they have mechanical joints, but I could see this being a possessed animated suit of armor with some added flames here and there that could work beautifully. And then finally, from the last model from that range is the one that we saw in the last painting in the golden hat competition. Heavily converted though, but I forgot who made it. Maybe you guys can help me out.
Paint this, I believe.
Yeah. Well, it's the base model you're seeing here, and I don't really have to explain why this would work very well as a destroyer or even maybe a fireborn. But the same problems you mentioned with buying them arise here as well, and that's there are only maybe 2 or 3 positions that you can get them in. Now with digital files, you have the freedom to add or modify them yourself, or even be lazy and just mirror them, so you can like, you know, slightly alter them and maybe mirror them on their x-axis while giving you 2 poses for very little effort. But yeah, I find these. I like him, but they don't fit in my Grimdark army, per se.
Cool. I just want to mention about the fact that these ones you've said here, these kind of robotic, I would say, looking ones, right? There might only be 2 poses of them, and the head's a separate part, I believe, because you could have the helmeted one twice or the skull one twice, so you get a little bit there. But if the robot dwarf, the robot Kdaii are repeated, that doesn't mess with my brain that much because it's still quite a feasible thing that all these machines would have been created in the same forge and would look the same. In that the same way that the repeated fire being the exact same shape does. So I actually think that these ones, although I know what you mean, it would have been lovely to have more poses of them. I do think that these models being repeated in a unit would work better than some of the ones that I showed made out of fire being repeated. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
I would really like to see somebody lean into that issue and have a unit of 6 or 9 or whatever Fireborn and have no similar models. Have them all cherry picked from a handful of different places. I think that'd be really interesting to see, and just lean into it.
Yeah, definitely.
You know, these Chaos Dwarfs are going around experimenting, just throwing whatever demon they can. Maybe these certain demons would be bound into these suits of armor necessarily, or other ones are just kind of this raging fire elemental they're just barely managing to contain within, you know, a helmet. So you could run with this a lot of different ways, and it'd be interesting to see if you know, somebody pulls off you know, aesthetically reasonable looking unit of just completely cherry picked models.
Well, in my head canon anyway, the demon should influence the end result. So, assuming that there are many fire demons available, I would assume that, you know, they build some contraption to contain the demon, but the demon's properties decide where it can be bound in what kind of armor or stuff like that. So I wouldn't really even mind seeing a Kdaii unit with completely different scopes and completely different sizes and models, as long as the paint job binds it all together into a unit.
Absolutely. Yeah, it definitely could be done.
Unless somebody has something else to add to that, I'd like to continue with the Lost Kingdom Devastator.
Absolutely, Michael. It wouldn't be a podcast if you weren't bigging up Lost Kingdom miniatures.
Well, obviously. This one was part of the Kickstarter, as is many of the stuff I own. And well, this would not be a Fireborn for me. This can only be a destroyer, because it's just absolutely massive and imposing. But I really love this model, and it's absolutely on my to print list. Well, as soon as my to paint list shrinks a little bit, whenever that might happen. But I like this. I'm not gonna linger too long on this one, because we've all seen it. But it's really detailed, as is everything they make. And I forgot I have a second Lost Kingdom model. Well, I'm not gonna stick too long at this one too, because we discussed this in all colors and smells in the previous podcast. But as I mentioned before, I think if you remove all the guns and the chains of the magma, what's it named? Magma walker, magma thing, whatever. I think this would be a very, very well looking demon magma stony golem looking thing. This would be a perfect destroyer for me. And it's probably going to be printed like that in a far future. But yeah, only 2 from Lost Kingdom this time.
Hey, Michael, before we run away from Lost Kingdom, they also have those the Magmahoran golems that I think I posted as well. And yeah, just while we're on that subject, I actually think, and now that I'm seeing these kind of all together, I'd be interested to see what base that Magmahoran magma launcher, piloted by a dude that we discussed a lot. I'd be interested to see how that could live as some unit filler in a unit that contains the Lost Kingdom Magmahoran golems, which have 3 very awesome poses. I'm not sure if you've dug into those models a little bit, but they almost look like they have just these kind of what Jack was discussing earlier with the TT models, just large fists of rock bound to the ends of their hands with various kind of spikes. But they have kind of the bullhead aesthetic, similar to the Lost Kingdom Destroyer, Devastator. A little magma running out from their mouth. But I think those models are certainly on my list. I actually already did grab those files. If I were to go for a second unit of Kdaii, I think I'd probably start with these and then maybe try and flesh that unit out. Now that I'm seeing it, I'd be interested to see what base size could get that the magma launcher to live on, as it has a very similar look to it with the rocks at the ends of its legs, and could potentially, serve as a unit filler instead of a standalone destroyer, although I'm sure it would service as either.
So you post that picture, and for a second I was like, stay in your lane, Reaver. But on the other hand, because you posted the picture, I completely forgot to add it to my list. Yeah, they would work really well, obviously. I think that's why they were designed by Lost Kingdom. And sadly enough, that's the only Patreon release I didn't get. For some reason, I threw away the subscription, unsubscribed from their Patreon for that month. I forgot why. But yeah, I don't have those in my collection. That's the second reason I forgot to make the segue. They are well, Fireborn or anyway Kdaii. There's no way around those. And good shout, thanks. Now I forgot where I was. All right, the art film ones. I got these before I decided to print a Chaos Dwarf army. And at first, it's the theme of that release is Magma Lords. I think that's what it's called, and it goes from these demon type things to, well, giants. Actually, I entered a picture of the giant I printed, the first one, the siege giant, really like the giant dwarf. It's also the same release, But the thing I like about these specific models, the Fireborn, that's the first one you see from them. It has 7 different poses. Now they're not completely unique because I think there are like 3 or 4 different tail sections and then a few different tops. But in the end, if you put them in a unit, they look different enough for it to work for 7 units or maybe even more because it's quite a large number to build a unit from. And then there's also a champion type one who's wielding 4 swords or something like that. And I immediately like these. They're called fire salamanders, but I instantly saw Fireborn. And the cool part about that is they also have 2 weapon options. So you could make 2 different units with different weapons to make them aesthetically differently. And they are nice. They have like these magma firestone tails which have metal scales embedded in them, if that's the right word. I didn't include a picture of the ones I painted. I forgot. But they work really well in a unit, and they fit nicely on a 40mm base, so that's a big bonus. And another model that's included in this release is the one that I first picked to be the destroyer in my army. Now, there's one thing I don't like about these, and that's that they're basically mirrored. Like the front and the back, they have 2 sets of arms. They have 2 sets of, they can have 2 sets of legs. They have 2 heads and stuff like that. It's like basically 2 models stuck together. But they do, like, if you look at them, it's like it's a hulking suit of armor, like thick plate armor with flames coming out of them. So that worked really well for me. I had a really hard time painting them, and I'm still looking at them. They're still on my painting table because they don't feel complete, but they look good enough. I'm not sure what to do with them. But I like these, and they have a lot of options because you can give them. I think they had like 6 or 7 different weapon options for each side of their arm, left and right. Different head options, different leg options. Really versatile. And if you don't like those, then they also no, sorry, forgot. I thought I had another one, but apparently I didn't post it or I didn't have one. So yeah, that's the last destroyer actually.
Here's a question for you, Michael, about Archvillain in general, and I wasn't aware of all of the posability options that they're including. That's awesome to hear. I'm curious as to if that's an artifact of their Patreon releases, or if you were to go, and purchase these as one-offs. For example, these destroyers, are you purchasing an individual pose in that sense, or are you purchasing the kit
I
with
couldn't give
options?
you a definite answer, but I would be very well, I'd be surprised if they like make a specific model and sell it like that. I suppose you just buy the kit, but I haven't checked because I'm subscribed to their Patreon and I'm not buying any of their separate models. The thing with, for example, Lost Kingdom, they have like teams. They have a Chaos Dwarf release, they have a Lizardman release, they have a Tomb King release, and they rotate these. With Archvillain, they just pick something and that's what you get. You get a whole lot of models, you get a whole lot of detail, but mostly it's like a one-off theme. They have some deep sea creature like things. They had a really cool circus, I think it was called Cirque du Grotesque or something like that. Just really chaosy circus vibe. They had another one with frost kings, like frost giants and stuff like that. But they do not really have specific Chaos Dwarf or even Warhammer army themed stuff. It's just basically a lot of beautiful random models. But yeah, I'd be surprised if they like split up a specific model into one pose and then just sell that. If I quickly look at their website, you buy a collection, and a collection has multiple poses. So I assume you get all of them.
Oh, that's awesome. just in case anybody's looking to go cherry pick.
Nice.
Their quality is really, really insane. I mean, it's pretty. The first time I found them, I think it's one of the first Patreons I subscribed to, even before Lost Kingdom, because they didn't have one yet, and I was really impressed with what you get. As I said, the only downside is I haven't really had a release that gave me even part of a Chaos Dwarf or even a Warhammer army, except for the ones I've shown here, because they happen to fit well with the fire team. Cherry picking wise, there's a lot of good stuff in there, especially if you go Chaos or Demon of stuff like that. And even for you, there's the Trench, it's called Abysmal Depths. I mean, if you ever get a set of them, that should be your first pick with your nautical themed army.
Yeah, I've definitely eyed some of them up.
So yeah, that's
sure.
about it. Actually, there's probably a lot more, but well, I don't own those, and I don't really know the ones I don't know. So
Well, I've got one extra one to add, gentlemen, if it's all right, because something that popped into my mind just now was when I was putting together this issue of the zine. I'm doing an army gallery for a relatively newcomer to our forum, M to the X, who's got a really, really cool, very unique Chaos Dwarf army that he runs for the 9th Age. And for those of you who haven't seen his army, make sure you check it out on the forum. But he has had a very fun and novel and interesting approach to Kdaii Fireborn. I think I should probably share with you. So for those of you watching on YouTube, this will be popping up on your screen. For those of you at home, who are listening at home on audio, I'm going to describe this to you instead. He has taken the approach that Reaver was talking about earlier by using some kind of clump foliage or foam or something to create a fire or smoke effect. And he has made these utterly, utterly crazy Kdaii, which are Chaos Dwarfs, like actual physical Chaos Dwarfs, without legs. Instead of legs, there are massive, fiery rocket plumes coming out beneath them, like they are rising up into the air like rockets. They are absolutely crazy. And I think he's used the original 1990s Blood Bowl team there in order to create this. So the Centaur already didn't have legs, so didn't need to worry about. But the other Chaos Dwarfs, I suppose their feet are either cut off or somewhere hidden within that. And I just thought it just goes a little way to showing how, as always with Chaos Dwarfs Online, there's always going to be a creative and novel approach to creating these things that you just never would have thought of, would you? Absolutely would never have thought of doing it this way.
I mean, I'm not really picky on what you use as a proxy model. I mean, if it's somehow somewhat fits, I'm okay with it. But especially with demon type stuff, yeah, you can go in so many different directions, and these again wouldn't fit in my army for 1 minute. They would clash tremendously, but they are really cool to look at, and it's very interesting to have the concept of a Chaos Dwarf that's possessed or something like that. It's an interesting take on the concept.
A really good use of the Blood Bowl models as well, and there are certain cases trying to use Blood Bowl models where you might have to make quite substantial adjustments to have a nice looking miniature, but the Blood Bowl poses are spot on for this use to me. A lot of them are kind of that looming, like about to tackle you kind of look, and I think it suits this idea really well, where these guys are legitimately towering over any infantry sized model, and I think that works really well.
Yeah, it's kind of tapping in as well, isn't it? To that genie kind of look, like the Jin that Lloydra, that Eddie drew, and similar thing to what you created for the last competition, Reaver, where the idea of Chaos Dwarf genie is now becoming something of a recurring meme on our forum, and it's interesting, isn't it? This is a classic thing with Chaos Dwarfs Online. We get no official support for our faction from the company. That may be changing in a year or two, who knows? But we get no official support, and so we end up creating our own ideas, and these own ideas end up becoming self-replicating. Before you know it, it's now law. Chaos Dwarfs have genies.
I wanted to say the best part for me about Chaos Dwarfs is you can basically just take any bit box and throw some glue in there and just create some fluff, and you get a model that would still fit. I mean, you can go really crazy with whatever you want to make, and you can still make it fit within the army fluff wise. And the fun part is, I actually started playing Lizardman for this reason because, well, not necessarily like kit bashing stuff, but because you can like go crazy with the color scheme and you can just explain it fluff wise. And then I went to Skaven because they build all these weird stuff, and again you can just fluff wise explain why it's so crazy or out there. And then I rediscovered Chaos Dwarfs, and I seem to have this going theme with my armies where I um, always see possibilities to make stuff. I don't make a lot of stuff, but I see the possibilities to make crazy stuff that doesn't really, well, I could never wield it because it doesn't have any rules, but fluff wise it would be very easy to incorporate into my army.
Definitely. Do you sometimes think like the lack of support that we've had as a faction over the years has in some ways been an absolute blessing because it has allowed for this creativity to blossom? Like if you wanted to introduce something crazy to an Empire army, there would be people who have read all the novels and read all the army books and would say to you, I'm really sorry, mate, but that doesn't fit. The Empire doesn't have that. When Demigryph Knights were first brought out, towards the end of Warhammer Fantasy Battles life, people went a little bit crazy. It was like, whoa, 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 where have all these Griffin things been if now everyone's all of a sudden riding around? Where have they been for the past 30 years of storytelling? Little did they know Age of Sigmar was going to make Demigryph Knights look like the most normal thing on the table. But at the time, they seemed very crazy. But with Chaos Dwarfs, where we haven't had that support, we can go as crazy and as left field as we like, and people won't really turn around to us and go, that thing doesn't exist in the Darklands. They'll turn around and go, we haven't got a clue what exists in the Darklands. That may well be one of the things that exists out there. Sometimes there's a sweet spot with fluff that they give you where too much of it really prescribes what you can do on the tabletop and have it exist in their universe. Not enough of it can make it very hard to come up with any ideas. But there's a sweet spot where we have a rough idea of what this society is like, a rough idea of what the world they live in is like. But most of it is now up to us to be creative and put what we want in there. I like that.
I've got to be honest with you, Oxy. And this is a bit hipster of me, I know, but like I do have this feeling that over the course of the next 3 years, we're going to get blown up pretty massive as a fandom, right? And the forum has always had a kind of pretty tight control on the IP, as it were, to be honest. We've been the people who've owned and pushed Chaos Dwarfs over the last 10, 15 years, right? But the combination of Total War Warhammer 3 making the Big Hat range and Asgore, like mainstream video gamers all over the world are going to be messing around with it. They're going to draw the Darklands and divide it up into a map, and everything is going to be there, and there's going to be a whole unit roster and all of this kind of stuff. A lot of the like 90s vagary and options, and like even Asgore didn't spell out the politics of the Darklands. That Asgore was one army of one outpost right on the edge. And we're going to lose some of that mystery, and we're going to lose another angle on it when the AOS range comes out, because there'll be tons of people who will buy those minis, and many, many, many more new takes will be, happening all over the world. And like, I'm excited for all those things, but there is a small part of me that's also almost a bit sad, because I want it to stay obscure so that I can make up my own fortress and nobody can tell me that fortress isn't real.
I get that, mate, and I'm very, very similar. I am both excited for the new blood that will inevitably come in with Total War, and the new blood that will inevitably come in with any new releases in Age of Sigmar. For the new fluff, new lore, new models, that's all got to be positive. Can't be a negative. But yeah, there is that very small hipster part of me that will continue to say, Chits, I promise I will continue to say, I liked Chaos Dwarfs before they were cool.
mean, Games Workshop should really be thanking us here. We've been their idea incubator for quite some time now, so just watch out for 2024 when we get Chaos Dwarf Genies in AOS. Calling it.
Yeah, that's it. We're calling it now. Absolutely, absolutely. And do you know what? I'm not saying that we are influential enough to make to make Games Workshop release something or not release something or anything like that. But we are disproportionately, I would say, disproportionately creative and influential as a forum for the amount of people that are actually involved in it. We are a relatively small forum, but the amount of talent and creativity and ideas that come out of that, I think is disproportionate. And I wouldn't be surprised if we do see some of those ideas that have come up from our forum in some of these future ideas. Now, some of that will be because a good idea is a good idea, and other people come up with it separately. But other things will be things that have just been generally pushed in the kind of zeitgeist of Chaos Dwarfs by the forum users and by the Facebook users and all that kind of stuff over time. It'd be interesting to see what does and doesn't get rid of. Now, I'm more thinking Total War here. What does and doesn't get involved in Total War. Total War was going to explicitly be in the world that most of us have been putting our Chaos Dwarfs in and have been experimenting and playing with. The Age of Sigmar one, all bets are off really, because they'll do what they want with that. They may well do a homage to the past. They may well forge a completely new direction. They may well try and do a little bit of both.
And I guess that brings us full circle back to just kind of trying to read the tea leaves on the Hobgrotz armor and think, does this mean something or doesn't it? And we're just going to have to wait and see. But isn't it nice that we've got something to wait and see?
Yeah, it's been a long time, hasn't it? It's been a long time since the speculation has been about what's coming next. The speculation for the time that I've been involved in Chaos Dwarfs Online, which hasn't been a very long time. I think it's been about 4 or 5 years of lurking, about 3 years of actual active involvement, about 2 years maybe, not a long time. But the conversations have been about, when are we going to get dropped from Forge World? What's going to go first? What's going to disappear? That's where the conversation will be going. Whereas at least now the conversations are going to be about what's coming next? What are we going to get? What's it going to look like? And for some people, it's going to be, wow, these new things, they're absolutely brilliant and I love them. I'm going to start collecting Chaos Dwarfs all over again, or start a second army, or add these to my existing army. And that's going to be a brilliant positive thing, because it's going to be getting more people involved in this. There will be an element of us who will see it and will go, that's gross. I hate it. I don't want it. Why have they done this to my beloved army? But that will also be a positive thing in a way, because it will solidify what it is you love about your Chaos Dwarfs, and it will probably make you even more protective and in love for your Chaos Dwarfs and collect them even harder and paint them even more. In a similar way that, the old world was got rid of, and that hasn't stopped people loving the old world. In fact, some people have become, I think, even more entrenched in their love of the old world, because it's something they now feel is like an endangered thing.
All right, maybe that's where we should end our story for today.
Yeah, and I think actually that's quite a nice point to go on to, talking about what we're going to be doing next, because next we're going to be having an interview with another kind of defender of the old ways, someone who saw some of the new stuff coming out and instead of going with that, joined a community that has preserved some of the old ways, but has also been extremely creative in creating new ways to enjoy the old ways. Now, we're talking about the Ninth Age. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Ninth Age is a rank and flank fantasy game that is community created by a lot of people, not only, but a lot of people who are veterans of the old Warhammer Fantasy Battle. Now, this is not a 9th edition or a fan edition of Warhammer Fantasy Battles. This is its own game with its own army books and its own systems. But what it is it's a game that fills that niche. It fills that niche that has been left by the end of the old world. So it's a square-based rank and flank fantasy game, which focuses on balanced play but also on creative, fluffy, and fun factions, a lot of which will resemble fantasy armies and archetypes you know well. Some of which will be new takes on some of those armies. And the guy we're talking to today, Tyranno, has had the really cool and privileged position to be the leader of a team creating the Hobgoblin army book for the 9th Age. And Chitz and myself were lucky enough to sit down with him last week and have a good old chinwag about how this book was created, about what it contains, what it doesn't contain, about how you can get involved in the 9th Age and their community. And we also gave him a couple of cheeky questions about his opinions on the new Hobgoblins come out as well. So hopefully you enjoy listening to it. But from the main team here today, that's all we have prepared. So we'll say goodbye now, and then we'll hand you over to last week's interview. So, catch you later. Ta-da. Okay, hello listeners, and really happy to tell you that we've got Tyranno from the forum with us here today. Myself and Chitzkoi are going to be sitting down and talking to Tyranno about some of the really cool projects he's been working on lately. One of them being the Hobgoblin book for the 9th Age game. So that's something we're really excited about, and something hopefully he's going to be able to give us some of the details on and let us know how we can get a hold of this book and how we can get into the 9th Age system and the 9th Age community as well. Hello Tyranno, how are you, mate?
Hello, I'm good. How are you?
Yeah, not bad. I'm enjoying the weather now that it seems to have improved somewhat in this part of the world, but generally fine, yeah.
I think the saddest thing is, especially all three of us are in the UK, we're no longer going to have an excuse to stay inside and play with our toys because the world's going to be reopened. So we're just going to have to go back to being normal recluses.
I know. It's going to be a case of, instead of having to sit inside and paint my toys on my own, I'm going to have to sit inside and invite my mates over to game instead. Either way, I get to shun society just the same amount. Right, so Tyranno, the thing that we want to talk to you about today was Hobgoblins, but let's start off by talking about your hobby, mate. I mean, how did you get into Warhammer? When did you get into Warhammer, and how did you get into the kind of the miniature collecting, painting, and gaming sort of hobby?
I think I got into it right about the sort of the times that Lord of the Rings was sort of wrapping up. I think Return of the King or the Two Towers had just come out, and I'd been on a holiday to see sort of, it was just a place that built little dioramas. But when I got back home, I sort of looked around and saw there was a shop that sold those sorts of similar things. And it was a Games Workshop, and then I sort of went in there. And hilariously, I lived 30 seconds away from it. A lot of people's dreams there. And so I went in there and I bought some of the models for it. I wasn't a huge fan of actually playing the Lord of the Rings game. I found it a little bit hectic and not as epic as the actual films. You didn't get as many like guys. But then I noticed that they had other stuff on sale, and I'm also a paleontologist, so I saw the lizard men. I was like, oh, now you've got my attention. And then picked them up, and that's sort of how my sort of Warhammer quote-unquote career started.
Outstanding. Oh, paleontology. I tell you what, outside of this recording, that's something I could chat to you about for absolute hours. That was top of my list of things I wanted to do when I was younger. I think it's quite interesting you said the Lord of the Rings there. I think that was a similar time for me. It was quite it was a very big outing for kind of fantasy settings and mass battles and all that kind of stuff. And I think for me as well, that was a time when I was first getting into the hobby, and it really solidified in my mind about how cool it was to just have all these legions of orcs and legions of elves being smashed together, and the fact that you could recreate that sort of thing on a tabletop. Yeah, that was magic. Yeah, as part of Chaos Dwarfs Online, our online forum, and you're a Chaos Dwarf collector yourself, find yourself in the niche of Chaos Dwarfs Online.
Edition was starting, and the new 7th edition starter set literally contained nothing but dwarves and goblins. And I thought, hang on a minute, this isn't a 2-player starter set. This is a single-player Chaos Dwarf starter set. And so I picked it up, and I basically just used all the goblins as hobgoblins, and with my sort of very poor at the time modeling skills, I just basically added loads of spikes to the dwarves, and then added some little pillars to the cannon to make it sort of look more upright for an earth shaker. And effectively, I had chaos dwarves.
That's so cool, because that really is seen by a lot of people on the forum as an almost a bit of a golden age in our forum days, the Battle of Skull Pass days, when so many people had come to the exact same conclusion as yourself, where goblins versus dwarfs, why not goblins with dwarfs? Let's turn this into one big army collecting box. And I think, we can still see people like Xander's armies and Tubbs' armies and stuff from the time where they did that. And actually, if you look back at the first ever Golden Hat competition, I'm pretty sure the first ever Golden Hat competition was actually to convert a Battle of Skull Pass warrior into a Chaos Dwarf warrior.
That's actually quite amazing, because I would have thought there were more people who had perhaps started during 5th edition, during like when the actual models were out.
Yeah,
You couldn't find any.
I don't think so. I think the current generation of Chaos Dwarf fans, right, if they're not the grognards, mostly in our kind of early 30s, in some cases even late 20s. And I think most of those people heard about Chaos Dwarfs as this mythical lost army that had actually was starting to be removed from circulation when they were getting into the hobby. And it gave Chaos Dwarfs a kind of a cachet. It was like this concept that was encapsulated in these 2 words, but it was obscure. It was like the first hipster army to really be contemporary with our generation of the hobby. And the only things more obscure are all the stuff that GW's been mortgaging recently, like, Ambles and Zotes and that kind of stuff. And I think it was a range that was big enough and distinctive enough to be a really strong flavor, but then obscure enough that nobody ever saw it in a shop. You know what I mean? There was never an official Warhammer Armies book. And I think that's what makes the Skull Pass generation so interesting, because the Skull Pass generation were told you're not allowed Chaos Dwarfs, and they went out and they made it happen for themselves anyway.
True, that is absolutely so true.
I actually used to get bullied by the dwarf players because they hated the army so much.
I think that's awful.
Correct,
Just out of interest, this must have been your very earliest days of conversion, and you're one of the best converters on the forum. But it's really interesting looking at the idea that your roots are in Skull Pass with a lot of the rest of us. What was that early first generation Tyranno army like?
It was very much like if you just went onto Microsoft Paint, put a Chaos Warrior, and then just stretched it wide. That was basically what my dwarves looked like. They just had Chaos Warrior heads on them, but I trimmed the horns off to try and make them look a bit streamlined, I think is the best word. And then I swapped the weapons for the Chaos Warrior ones. And in some cases, I even managed to shave the shields off and put the Marauder ones on, because the Chaos Warrior ones were never going to fit. So the Marauder ones.
Starting your lifelong relationship with kit bashing.
Yeah, pretty much.
These guys back at the shop who were taking a piss and stuff about you having a Chaos Dwarf army and didn't like you playing with them. I mean, I know it was years ago, but do you remember what their reason for that was?
They played dwarves and they thought it was a stain on their honor.
The law, very, very seriously. It wasn't that's mad.
Yeah, I found sometimes you can get some funny things with certain people play certain armies, and I find sometimes you get a similar attitude. I've noticed the Goblin players are always a bit of a kooky bunch, for example. It seems like elves are certainly a little bit stuck up. Elf players are stuck up, I found. It's really weird. And vampire players are always about power and getting more power.
Well, and everyone knows the Wah guy, right?
Yes, there's always one guy.
You can hear him from the other fucking side of the building.
Oh, I could. There was one guy who did it at a tournament in a aircraft hangar with multiple floors, and they heard him from a different floor.
See, I'm a 40k orc player on and off since I was about 10 years old. And it's always had that bit in the rule books, hasn't it? You can shout "Wah" as well while you play it. and I've always just been so fucking timid. It's just like, I'm going to take my my war now. Okay, thank you. Interesting. So let's have a little chat about the projects you've been working on lately. Now, the book, the Hobgoblin book you've been working on, is for a game called The Ninth Age. Now, maybe if you could just, Tyranno, give us a bit of a breakdown, and this can be as simple or as detailed as you like, really, for the listeners at home. What is the Ninth Age? If you had a friend who was into wargaming but wasn't aware of the Ninth Age, how would you kind of describe it to them?
Okay. The Ninth Age is a square-based fantasy battle simulator. Quite a lot like how Warhammer used to be, in that you have units of models on square bases, but you also have some individual models on square bases, like giants and dragons. It's all, not all online, but all the rules and everything are online and can be downloaded completely for free. The entire project is also completely, I don't want to say fan-made, but it's made by people who were fans and sort of came together to create this sort of entire game. And it's constantly growing. It's a living game in the sense that there are relatively frequent balance updates, where you'll get points changes based on tournament results and things like that. It's quite a very, I don't want to say strictly balanced game, but it's very well balanced. And well, some people may shrug that off as, I'll win it all cost tournament players. I found that for casual players, there is nothing better than a balanced game, because back in the day, if you were to take a fun Warhammer army, you would quite often just get ruffle stomped if you just took the fun stuff, because some guy, even if he wasn't win at all costs, would have taken something that just happened to be superior and would just crush you. But
that's
here,
what's happening in AOS now.
Yeah, that's the thing about the competitive, isn't it? And I do have to declare my bias straight away. I am very, very much a narrative gamer. You know, I paint things that I think look pretty or cool, and I write army lists because the book says it would be good that way, as in like the novels and stuff, or because I've had an imaginative idea. But when I used to, and I don't do a lot of club gaming anymore, when I used to do club gaming, I found that if everyone is a different type of player, it forces everyone to be a tournament player. Because if you turn up with a fluffy list and he turns up with a tournament list, neither of you are going to have fun. That tournament player isn't going to learn anything. They're not going to have any challenge. And you're going to get all your toys out and then you're going to put all your toys away immediately afterwards and go home. And an unbalanced game just exacerbates that problem, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And some factions don't get the good graces of being given a tournament list at all, right? Which is the situation for Gloomspite at the moment, where they've got too many randomized faction mechanics to the point where if you like the models and you want to play tough, you're not going to have a good time.
Shame, isn't it?
You're giving me very bad nostalgia for all the really sort of horrible times where I'd buy some models that just got released and it turns out they were not very good, and it would be just an absolute one-sided slaughterfest. And that's actually what made me, I don't want to say better at the game, but it forced me to become way more competitive, because there was just no alternative, because either I just get absolutely crushed every time, or I work my ass off to try and beat the opponent. And then you'd also get factionalism with people who did play casually and they'd hate the people who played in tournaments, and it never got very pleasant. But with Ninth Age, I will say that going to tournaments, it has been the most pleasant experience in wargaming I've ever had. They're the nicest people. Everyone there is there for a good time, because they know that at the end of the day, all their units are relatively well balanced, comparatively. So no one's there just bringing almost like a gimmicky army and is going to just get absolutely spanked just because they brought stuff they liked. You can bring stuff you like, and you've got as much a chance as anyone else.
I would argue as well, and you might be able to tell if I'm right or wrong here, but at a ninth age tournament, surely you're in a room full of people who have all at some point made a decision to basically divorce themselves from the constant meta change of a living Games Workshop game. They've made that decision to go, I'm not playing that anymore, I'm playing something else. And so that I would suggest weed out a certain group of players who maybe wouldn't be as much fun.
I'm not a psychologist, but I've had similar discussions as to what were the players who were quote unquote not left behind playing with Games Workshop games, and who were the ones who went and played like ninth, or even went back to playing older versions of fantasy. Like, what mindsets were behind those? And it does make me wonder, because there were very unpleasant people I'd played against, not commonly, but there were ones that were pretty horrible during my Warhammer days, and I just never see them touch like certain other games, because I guess there is some sort of mindset behind playing a certain game.
Yeah.
I'm not saying AOS players are horrible. I'm not trying to say
No,
that.
of course not. Of course not. Yeah.
No. I realize it could have come across like that, but it's just certain games will always attract certain types of people for whatever reason. And I think the word you possibly were looking for was meta chasing.
Yeah.
Where you abandon whatever you've got and just quickly jump on to the next thing. It's very common in card games, which I used to play quite a lot of. And that's really easy to meta chase because it's just a deck of cards. You can just quickly sell it off to someone else when you think it's about to die, and then just buy a new deck quickly.
And my understanding, Tyranno, is that as part of the game mechanics of Ninth Age, you're actually not required to set fire to your army. Is that correct? Because my understanding is that the vintage square-based community has had some issues with flammable and game mechanics that require armies to be set on fire, and I'm pretty sure that Ninth Age is the club for people who liked Warhammer Fantasy but not setting fire to square-based miniatures.
Yes, I do wonder who that person was who did that. We all know what we're thinking about here. That guy who set fire to his Dark Elves, like on the day GW did that. I have seen people who do pine for Warhammer, who really want the old days back, because they grew up with the fluff, they loved it, and to see what happened, I guess it does eat away at some people. But the Ninth Age isn't trying to be Warhammer like 2.0. It's trying to be its own thing. It's trying to be its own game. It's got its own background, its own lore. The ninth part is actually is a lore sort of derived part of the game. It's sort of the like with Elder Scrolls, where they're in like the fourth age timeline.
Yeah.
It's sort of like that. It's like this is actually sort of the ninth sort of age of the world.
Lovely.
And in terms of mechanistically, just like super high level, because I'm sure there's tons of stuff. Let's say you were a square-based Warhammer Fantasy player, or you might still be an 8th edition player with your mates. What are the mechanistic differences that you're going to experience in Ninth Age, and like why are they so much more enjoyable? Because it really is that system that, for me, from the outside, just as a collector at this stage, everyone involved in Ninth Age says, "Oh, it's cracking."
I'd say that it feels both familiar, but it feels also streamlined. Like some clunky elements of Warhammer have been trimmed, like that were present, would have been trimmed down or made a lot easier. Like, for example, there's a lot greater use on sort of cards. The best way I can explain this is with Magic. With Magic, what you get is you get a deck of 8 cards, and you shuffle them before the game, and you place them down, and you'll draw one at the start of each Magic phase. And what it has is it has a set of numbers. The first number is how many dice both players get, and the second thing is something called Veil tokens. The Veil is sort of where the demons hide behind. It's like a nether realm. And it's why the demons also have some of the best magic in the game, because they can just pull straight from it, lore-wise. And what you can do is you can turn 3 of those points into an extra magic dice. So you can buy Veil tokens, for example, through magic items, or you're having more spellcasters, or even just specific spellcasters or even units having the ability to generate more. So you can generate loads of power for a magic phase. It's sort of quite like the old sort of Zinch themed Warriors Chaos Army back in 6th edition, where you can sort of generate your own power through your units. But it's a lot more streamlined because you just look at it and once you know how the system works, it's very easy to go flip it over, go, okay, I know exactly what the opponent's got to work with. I know what I've got to work with. Let's get down to business.
Nice.
So it's flexible, it's balanced, and it's streamlined. That's what I'm hearing from what you're saying to me, and I quite like the sound of that.
Now the question I'm going to ask is, if your mate who's asking about the 9th Age has a Warhammer Fantasy army gathering dust on a shelf, or maybe like, I don't know, a Mantic Kings of War army, something on 20mm squares or whatever, can they typically use that army that they used in the old game in this game, or is it going to require quite a lot of adapting of base sizes or unit types and all that kind of stuff?
Almost none of sort of mucking around with stuff. If you've got an army on square bases, you can almost certainly use it in this, because there's a very clever system that every unit has. It's got a base size listed in the corner. So you can use it for any company's models effectively. So it'll just basically go, like for example, I can just pull open the book here. Hobgoblin levies, it says base size 20 by 20mm. So okay, if I've got a model that's on a 20 by 20mm base, it looks roughly goblin-esque, I could use it for that. If you've got an orc that could fit on a 25 by 25mm base, then it can fit on that. It's really flexible model-wise. It's really open, and in fact, this game has opened my eyes to companies outside of Games Workshop. Like, I've been looking at historicals, looking at other fantasy games. I've even taken a Star Wars model at one point.
That's interesting. It's very true. Well, I've recently been building fantasy armies, which are historical models. So I'm currently working on a 28mm Roman army, and I've been trying to just look at the different systems in which that can actually be used in. My gaming group primarily uses Warlords of Erewhon, so base size that doesn't matter in that at all. But I have both 6th and 8th edition Warhammer here at my gaming room, and I also have Mantic's Kings of War, but probably could use my my human army here in the 9th Age, couldn't I?
Yeah, perfectly. There are multiple human armies, but also there's multiple armies which are on the same size base as the humans. Like, if you really wanted to, you could take out our rat-based army, which is the Vermin Swarm, and you could play the Romans as them. There's no issue with that at all. In fact, the rats are supposed to play in a style similar to the Romans. Well, they will once they've been updated. The rats are actually going through an update at this point, and we'll see at the end of it what they look like.
Interesting. Now, you say about how the Hobgoblins are finished, the rats are going through an update. How do these books get created, and how do they get kind of updated? Because it's not like when a company owns an IP and says, we are doing this and we've hired this writers to it. From what I understand from talking to you, this is a bit more like of people within the community, the 9th Age community, are getting involved and are chipping in and stuff. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that. How do we go from not having a Hobgoblin book to having a Hobgoblin book?
All right. Well, the Hobgoblin book is an auxiliary book, which means it is sort of created to be an offshoot of one of the other books. But what happened was they sort of announced that the book is sort of coming out, the parent book, and then they started working on that one. And as it was sort of nearing completion, there was discussions internally about what should we do for an auxiliary? What are people going to enjoy? And we have specific staff called Army Community Support, several for each race, and they talk to the community, ask them sort of what they want, and sometimes even just sit and listen and read and see what people are looking for. Like, for example, I am actually the Army Community Support for Infernal Dwarves, which are the sort of kind of equivalent to Chaos Dwarves. And I noticed quite a lot of people had wanted to have more done with hobgoblins. They wanted a bit more like of them fleshed out. So when there was a discussion internally, I did suggest, hang on, why not have a hobgoblin army? Because then the people who would like more to do with hobgoblins can have exactly what they want. And there was a bit of discussion around it. I produced some evidence for it, and people go, okay, let's do it. And so then what happens is there's a team of people are sort of brought together, either people who sort of, I'm trying to think of the best way to say it, sort of almost sign up. Like they go, oh, I'd like to join the staff. They do a small interview, and then they sort of let them join, or not if they don't think they're quite qualified or have the spare time to spare. The latter is the most important bit, having the spare time to work on this, because it's almost not quite a charity, but it's sort of like it's just well, it is kind of almost like charity work. You're just working for free. The whole project is done for free. There's no money passing through it at all.
It's podcasts.
Yeah, like a lot of podcasts as well. But yeah, so a few people sort of got together to and started making the team. And it was a relatively small team, only a few people by comparison to the like main quote unquote books, who get quite a few more staff on them. And someone was basically labeled as the book lead, like the person who was supposed to sort of dictate roughly what direction like discussions are going to go, which in this case was me for the hobgoblins. And there was a few people who were supposed to work on rules alongside me, and there was also someone who was supposed to be from the background team, like the people who work on all the lore and everything, just to make sure everything is sort of like background like friendly, like it's sort of not too weird, like goes against background. We didn't really need him very much because it was relatively open, and also we kind of knew what we were doing from the start. Hobgoblins were probably one of the fastest books to come to actually be developed internally, because we kind of from the word go, we knew what the book was supposed to be based on. We knew what to look at, and so when it came to actually designing it, it was quite easy to find sort of ideas for the units and everything, and go, okay, we need this, okay, we'll open up threads on this unit and this particular unit, and we can have discussions in here. And just stage by stage, it was all done bit by bit. And when it was nearing completion, then we started doing some PR, releasing sort of information to the public, going, oh, hobgoblins are coming. And then a bit later, releasing a rules for a few units as the book neared completion. Eventually, the book was out.
Now, in terms of you've worked on the book with the team, and you've had your big discussions about what is and what isn't involved in this book. I would imagine you might tell me different, but I would imagine that a kind of starting point would be, what do people expect hobgoblins to have? For a lot of us, people who were either gaming in the 90s or have a nostalgia for gaming in the 90s, would be talking about the kind of the Scythian wolf riding goblins from Games Workshop's 1990s range, and people might have quite a fixed idea about what a hobgoblin army looks like. I'd be interested in what things have you put in this book that kind of pay homage to what's come before, and kind of what people expect from hobgoblins. But what else have you put in this book, perhaps, that goes in a new direction, or adds something that people maybe hadn't considered hobgoblins would have, but now that they've got a bigger range because of you having less limitations with this book, things they can have now?
Okay. When we were looking at what the hobgoblins were supposed to be, because we were trying to look, well, initially we had a historical army to base them off, because it gives us a few ideas of units to look at, and also army structure. We based them off the Sassanids, who were sort of the Persians during the Dark Age, to put it rather bluntly. We knew we couldn't make them like Scythians or Mongols like GW did before, partially due to the fear of the infamous GW attack lawyers, but also because we have factions who are also based on those. So we're a little bit hesitant of putting in like a clone effectively, because this was a big problem with Hobgoblins. Was there are already several like cavalry focused armies, being Kingdom of Equitaine, which are based on Frankish knights and also based on the Bretonnians, and then there's Makar, who are based on the Magyars. But they're also very Mongol as well. Like some people actually just use Mongol models for them. I do personally, because I also.
Yeah.
So the problem with Hobgoblins was not just we couldn't legally make them the same. It was actually more of we can't make them another light cavalry army, because there's already a very light cavalry heavy army in play, and we need to make sure this army has its own identity and its own sort of ideas of what it is supposed to be. It was quite interesting to do, because we also got to look into the mindset of the Hobgoblins and what makes them different from standard goblins. And it was sort of an idea that Hobgoblins are, I don't want to say more sensible, but they definitely aren't wacky and crazy like goblins are.
Mhm.
They were more sensible, and they think about the whole, like they think about their entire society. So Hobgoblins don't like breaking formation on their own. I mean, if the whole lot decide, you know what, I'm out of here, they'll all go. It's not like they can't flee. But it's like a single Hobgoblin doesn't like challenging anyone out to a duel, because he knows he's just going to get his head smacked in, and then he's going to put all the other Hobgoblins at risk. So they're a very sort of uniform society.
Interesting. As to like specific unit types, is there something that as specifically kind of you could point at as going, this was taken from something that Sassanid Persia had, and this is our Hobgoblin kind of take on that?
Oh yes, there are two main units, but actually probably three if I put them like that. There's the quite bluntly named Hobcataphracts. Sassanids were quite well known for their use of exceedingly heavily armored cavalry,
Absolutely.
which the Greeks called cataphracts. For us, like now, for the real world, they're a man on a horse and covered in like armor. For the Hobgoblins, it's a Hobgoblin riding an exceedingly large and very aggressive wolf that's built. It's kind of like a wolf, but if you bred it like you'd breed a cart horse, it's a really bulky animal. Like it's much slower than a standard wolf is in the game, but let's say its bite is worse than its bark.
Interesting.
There's another cavalry unit which is based on this really funny thing we found out, where the Sassanids used to call one of their cavalry units the Immortals, because they were trying to emulate the same kind of respect that the Achaemenid Persians did with their immortal infantry. So they named them the same. So we did the same, but we called them Eternals as a kind of like a cheap knockoff name. And
Very cool.
yeah, then the third unit is a unit called Tusker Mahuts, who are based on the Sassanid heavy use of elephants, and that's basically supposed to be like Hobgoblin elephant cavalry. Rather than ride on a big elephant, they're riding on a large sort of rhino-like creature. But there's still loads of little hobgoblins on the back with pointy sticks jabbing.
Yeah, this sounds really cool. This sounds to me a lot like if the Hobgoblins that I know from the previous game are these kind of steppe nomads and quite a small little raiding force that may come and go in and out of your territory, attack a village and disappear overnight. This sounds a lot more like the big Hobgoblin empire on your doorstep that really means business.
Yeah, it could be even played like that, because there are some light cavalry options. It's not many light cavalry options, because heavy cavalry is the focus in this army. But there are still some light raiding cavalry with sort of smaller lances and bows, who are supposed to be like harassment cavalry. So
Yeah.
it is definitely feel like these guys are the big deal. Although they are actually still, like with Chaos Dwarfs, these guys are vassals to the Infernal Dwarves. And in fact, there's quite a funny thing in the Hobgoblin lore where they are trying to use various tricks to pretend that their military isn't as good as it actually is.
Brilliant.
To sort of try and get out of the yoke of being a vassal state, because they're trying to secretly build their military up to overthrow the Vernador someday.
So they haven't lost their backstabbiness one bit.
No, they're just hiding it.
I guess for me, Tyranno, what interests me the most about the whole concept is that you're taking a faction that was really very small when it was conceived of, right? And I was talking about this on the Discord the other day. The total number of GW Hobgoblin units is like minuscule. It's like melee infantry, bow infantry, melee wolves, bow wolves, a bolt thrower, and the heroes. And then in the Dogs of War list, one character and one unit of light cavalry. And what you've done is you've kind of given it a lot more credibility. Are there any kind of armies besides the classic GW Hobgoblins that really inspired your design from a tabletop perspective rather necessarily than the historical perspective?
One thing I did look at was I did look at Total War Attila for a lot of the sort of designs and the ideas behind the units. There are some units which are basically Hobgoblin equivalents of those. Those are the ones. Was that the sort of question you were looking for? The answer you're looking for?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just super curious because, you know, you've added a lot to this whole concept, and I think it's fascinating all the different places that it's come from. If someone's going to play Hobgoblins in 9th Age, what's it going to play like? What factions is it going to be similar to?
Okay. I guess I don't think there's really any that you'd find in, like, definitely Warhammer, because that's the one I'm most experienced with, but other than this, that play like them. Because the Hobgoblin playstyle for this book is a lot of cheap infantry that try to sort of almost bog the opponent down to allow the heavy cavalry time to come in and crush the opponent. That's sort of the idea, is that they use a lot of static sort of combat resolution and just basically just holding there for just long enough for the cataphracts and the Mhuts to come in and sort of smash things. They're also a lot more focused on archery than before. Like, in fact, the Hobgoblin like special rule like that all the models have is an archery one, and it's part based on the Hobgoblin lore, and it's also part based on what the Assassins were good at, which was archery. But for the Hobgoblins, it's that they are traditionally were a hunter people. Their culture used to revolve around hunting, and they love hunting like large, small, or medium animal, any animal really they can get their like arrows into. And in fact, the entire point around the Eternals is that they're not a true bodyguard unit in the sort of normal sense. They're a bodyguard that just go out on hunting parties rather than just protect people in like a palace or anything. They're supposed to go out and aid the Hobgoblin general in just killing large wild animals. And so that's what these guys do on the battlefield. They just treat humans, elves, orcs, anything as an animal, and they'll hunt it the same way.
I think it's really interesting because I think what you've done is you've taken the kind of traditional role that we were introduced to Hobgoblins with via GW, which is chaff infantry, right? And you've taken a look at the Sassanids and said there's a resonance there, whether there's intentionally or not, that the Sassanids were known for the weakness of their infantry, right? That's all the Roman histories, and whenever the Romans catch them in the mountains or any kind of environment where they can't use their cavalry to full effect, they win. And a number of people become emperor via that route. And what you've done is you've taken that and you've said, yeah, everyone knows Hobgoblins are hopeless infantry, but then you've given them that extra flavor that draws on the kind of history of all the Wolf Rider ranges and Ogla Khan's Wolf Boys and the kind of Mongol concept, and turned it into this, what sounds like a really joined up whole, which I think is probably going to be a lot of fun to play.
Oh, thank you. That's very flattering. We've got a lot of positive feedback from people who have played the army. I mean, I'm not sure with the people who wrote some of the other books, but I've been getting quite a few like personal messages from everyone who's having fun with the book, and they're saying the book is really fun to play. It's not finished, by the way. It will undergo a couple of small revisions where we try to fix any potential problems, like the community sort of spots and go, as actually this unit isn't performing quite as expected, or this one is completely usurping the role of another one. So we'll have a look at those and adjust them as time goes. But thank you so much. That's really flattering. I was really hoping to catch that sort of Sassanid flavor with this book, but I didn't want to portray the idea of hobgoblins as like having crummy infantry.
Now, it'd be very, very hard for us to talk about hobgoblins today, Tyranno, without talking about the elephant in the room, which is, of course, that Games Workshop, after 30 years of doing very, very little with hobgoblins, at the time of recording, it would have been last weekend, announced that they now have a unit of hobgoblins in Age of Sigmar now. And that's a very, very strange timing. It's actually coincided with the completion, at least of the first draft of these rules. Have you had a chance to see the hobgoblin models that Games Workshop have brought out?
Yes, I have had the chance to see them. In fact, I saw them first when someone joked about them in a WhatsApp group I'm in about having Games Workshop basically just I'm not saying copied us, but sort of suddenly just making models to fit our game, which I'm not sure if I should be flattered or not, but slightly am. The models, I've seen them, and quite frankly, they're really nice. They're very, very detailed, and they're very gritty.
Yeah.
Which does fit with the hobgoblin aesthetic we've gone for, is that these are the kind of the gritty sort of members of the orcs and goblins, which Games Workshop has somehow also embraced at the same time as well, which I'm quite stunned by. I never thought I'd see the day.
That whole release has had a bit of a gritty orc aesthetic, and I think I'm trying not to repeat information too much because I'm aware that I'm recording this before we record the main podcast, where I'm sure the listeners already heard me waffle at length about what I think about the orcs, so I won't repeat myself here. But when you were talking there about having a large wolf the size of a cart horse as a piece of heavy infantry, that's where my brain went to, thinking that release certainly has a large sort of wolf or wild style creature that could easily be converted to fit this army list you guys have written.
Yeah, although I would advise listeners to probably use it for a character, because I don't really recommend buying 5 of these kits.
No!
Or
yeah, absolutely, for a hero or something. I was more thinking,
Yeah. For those listeners who don't have the book open, the hero level the general of the Hobgoblin army is called the Shah. So for a Shah, that would be really good. And in fact, I'm very tempted. In fact, one of my friends wants the entire Stormcast half, and they've offered to split it with me. So looks like I might be getting these hobgoblins after all.
That deal is being done all over the internet. Oxy and I almost did that deal, but I think I'm probably going to back out of it. I think that one of the things that's so bizarre is, like, most people on CDO have a pretty low opinion of Stormcast Eternals, but there's never been a bigger reason for us to make friends with Stormcast players and the kind of people that like them.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with that. In fact, I do often cannibalize Stormcast parts for some models because they've got some useful little bits here and there. But yeah, I was never a huge fan of them. Although this new design, while I'll never play them, is certainly a lot more easy on the eyes than the old one.
It's sane, isn't it?
It doesn't look like that wide Putin meme anymore.
It's certainly a step in the right direction. I mean, like, the meme about them being Space Marines in fantasy is done to death, but it's a meme for a reason, isn't it? They are Space Marines in fantasy. They'll have their differences. It's essentially what they are. But at least this one, as Chit said, has lent more into the realistic, more like a Romano Greco hero of myth, as opposed to power armor.
Yeah, they're a lot better. I do love the little sort of not quite chainmail, but the scale mail sort of cuirass they've got going on between the thigh plates. That's quite a nice little detail. It's one thing I hated about Space Marines is they never had anything between their legs, so they always made me think their thighs were tiny, and it just offset me visually every time I looked at them. Could never like something.
Honestly, Tyranno, I think you are a man of impeccable taste, and you are one of the sculptors whose achievements I am most in awe of. But I could not disagree with you more. That is the thing about the new Stormcast that I find more annoying than anything else in the world. Why are they wearing little scale mail skirts? I don't understand it.
Oh, I don't know logically why, but it stops their thighs being small, so I couldn't care less.
Bless them. Yeah, fair, very fair.
Yeah, and Chitz just mentioned your ability as a converter and your ability as a sculptor there, mate. I think it'd be amiss to have you on a podcast and not spend a little bit of time talking about your Dwarvish Mesopotamia blog. Now, those of you who are watching this on YouTube, with your permission, of course, Tyranno, we'll stick some pictures up from some of your work in progresses, if that's okay. And
my pleasure, of course.
Cool. And yeah, let's chat a little bit about that project, because just before you jumped on the chat here, myself and Chitz were having a little natter just about how impressed we have been with your blog and how of the myriad of cool armies that are on Chaos Dwarfs Online. There are many armies I'm jealous of, but we both agreed your army is an army we are both very jealous of. So for those of you who can't see the pictures that are coming up on the screen, Tyranno's created a Chaos Dwarf army using mostly plastics, Games Workshop plastics, kit bashed, converted together. And when I say kit bashed, I mean, like, I swear, Tyranno, you must be buying boxes of 30 models because you want that one banner or you want that one face, and he's converting these really beautiful, historically inspired Mesopotamian looking Chaos Dwarfs. Do you want to talk us a little bit about that project?
Well, this will go back to a little bit of my mixed attempt at advertising the Ninth Age, and it was basically when I looked at all the armies that Ninth Age had. This was when I was looking at my 8th edition Warhammer armies and going, okay, who can I use as what, and who goes where? And then I noticed that rather than just being either a 5th edition army that was just reduced to a single page or was a Forge World supplement, I noticed that basically the evil dwarves had been shoved in as a fully playable race and were just as playable as everyone else. So I thought, oh, this was the one I always wanted to play as a kid, but I couldn't really play very often because there are always people who are a bit iffy about playing against it, or the army used to be like entirely resin Forge World, and I did not have the finances to even remotely touch that at the time. But now I could just go whole hog on the army and build what I wanted. It started not too long after I started playing Ninth Age, because it was just at first I was using my beast, well now they're called beast herds, my beast men, against my friends, and then I spotted these and thought, oh, the dwarves. I'm like, oh, hang on. And so I started looking into the dwarf models available. I quickly put to one side any thought of using the Forge World stuff, because again, resin and I don't like working with resin as well. I don't like it as a medium. Other people are fine with it, but I can't stand it. So what I started doing was I started buying dwarves, like the plastic dwarves, and started mucking around with them and testing parts and seeing what worked and what didn't. And I found that the new sort of Khorne Bloodbound heads that came on, I think it was the Blood Reaver kits, were very dwarvish in sort of proportion. And you got like loads and loads of them in a box. So I thought, oh, hang on, I can just use them. And so I got these really mean expressions, some of them with horns, some with sharp tusks. And then I was like, okay, these fit onto the dwarf bodies, but they need beards. And so that started my effective career of trying to sculpt Mesopotamian style beards. And you can actually see, if you look at the blog, some of the beards are not as good as the others, but that just shows how long I've been doing this and how I've improved the beards over time. Oddly enough, one of the first ones I did is actually as good as the ones I did now. I'm not sure how it's still that perfect. It's the Sorcerer Prophet who's holding a small flame and a knife. But yeah, it was basically that, and from there I kept on going with the army. I tried a few versions of hobgoblins out, at first using Noblar heads on Skaven slaves, then Noblar heads on storm vermin, before finally settling on night goblin heads on storm vermin, because I found the Noblar heads were so small, so tiny, that they actually had no eye detail.
Oh,
Okay, that's not good. And I didn't find, and the large noses put me off because they whelmed the face completely. So I wanted something a bit more like you could see. But after a while of doing this, I started going, like I'm sort of like just spinning my wheels with this. I'm not really going anywhere with the models, and I needed some inspiration, especially considering I was converting the whole thing. So I started looking up various civilizations that the Chaos Dwarfs were originally based on. So I looked up the Babylonians. But then I not only did I think, oh, what other Mesopotamian civilizations are there? But there was an exhibition at the British Museum on the Assyrians. And to anyone who doesn't know who the Assyrians are, they basically make the grim darkness of anything Warhammer's written look like flowers and daisies. They are vicious, vicious people. And they did some of the most cruel and abhorrent things I've ever heard. And for everyone's sake, I'm not going to mention exactly what those all were. But I started using them as a inspiration, model-wise, like copying their armor, copying their shield styles. Like, for example, I noticed that all the Warhammer Tomb King shields were a lot closer to Assyrian ones than they were to Egyptian. So I started buying those up and started using them. And after a while, I realized this army I want it to look uniform. I want it to look like everyone's suit of armor has effectively come off the same sort of, not quite assembly line, but it's all made to look the same. It's all made to look like it's one army. And the only thing that should be different is maybe like the weapons, the shoulder pads, and the helmets, just to add flair and detail. And so I started using the same hammerer kit throughout the entire army. Literally, every dwarf in my army, apart from the ones who have no armor, is made from a hammerer.
It's the scale mail, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the scale mail. Because it didn't. The problem I found was some of the dwarves have Celtic runes carved.
yes.
And I'm like, no, I can't have like Near Eastern dwarves with the Triskelion just carved onto them. I can't have that because then it will just look off. And also, I know it's off, and it'll bug me, which is why I'm so determined to get this all right. Is because it will bug me. Like, I will just see something, and I'm like, no, I don't like that. It's bugging me now. So that's where I went and started using the hammerers. I also use the horribly spelled fire slayers as any dwarf who doesn't really need a lot of armor, like engineers or charioteers, for example. But after a while, I noticed that maybe that walking barefoot on burning hot metal is probably not the best idea. So then I gave them all the same hammerer tunic, because I had some old hammerers where the torso had been damaged, but the lower half was completely intact. So I started slicing those in half and then using them to combine with the engineers to make them look a bit more, A, more uniform, and B, so they don't have blisters all over their feet, because I don't like the idea of my poor dwarves having to have like burns painted on them. But yeah, it was mostly just sort of going through like what the Assyrians used to use, going through loads of, I've got books on them now. And it's almost kind of inspired me more to look into how the Assyrians did things and how like their culture was, because it's quite interesting doing all that research off the back of just loving a miniatures army. Quite interesting.
I think the thing with historically based fantasy armies, and this is something that you seem to really excel at, but a historically inspired and based fantasy army, there is something innately believable about it. And you don't have to know anything about Assyrians to look at your army and know it makes sense. To go, this feels like a real army that would exist and would march together. Because those historical influences are there. And like you were saying, the things like you recognise that those shields for the Egyptian-inspired force were actually a lot more Assyrian in design. You've plucked that and you put it in. Now, a layperson like me is not going to know that, but I do know that those shields really, really work and fit with that because you've done the research and you've looked at the styles of armour and the fashions of that society and you've made it match. And I do think, and I try not to do too much Age of Sigmar bashing because it's probably a subject for another day. I do think Age of Sigmar has some merits for some things, but one of the things that it does not do particularly well is it doesn't, in my opinion, really ground its designs in something known and tangible and believable. So everything just comes off as being a bit wacky. Whereas your army is definitely a fantasy army, but where it has its roots deeply in something known and believable and real life, it just seems to breathe more. It seems to live more.
Thank you. That's a lovely compliment. And that's also kind of what I was trying to achieve, because the idea was also with it being so historically based is not only because it makes my life easier for researching things, but also when people look at it, something in the back of the head says, yes, this works. Whereas some of the Age of Sigmar stuff, not all of it, mind, some of it's better than the others, but some of it, you look at it and the uncanny valley the alarm goes off in the back of your head and you're like, okay, that's not right. That's not right at all.
Bat centaurs, elves riding wallabies. I said I was going to talk about this. We started talking about it.
I've definitely got maybe a middle ground way of thinking about this, right? Which is there are some miniatures which demonstrate the direction GW could have gone if they'd just chosen to put 40k production values on Warhammer Fantasy Battle miniatures, right? And that's like the White King that they just released for Soulblight. Great.
Yes.
The vampires who are not centaurs, that is what you could have achieved. And even a Lariel on a giant fucking dung beetle, right? Okay, you could have had your era of centerpieces and it would have been fine. But they exited quite specifically from stuff that has those roots that you're describing, which and you know, Tomb Kings was a discontinued army for a reason, right? And equally, I think lots of the other more rooted stuff is discontinued because the motifs are so accessible and human and open that the wider miniatures market has seen a rush of creativity of, you know, people executing on those concepts better than GW did. And we've spoken about some of the ranges that use cuneiform, some of the ranges that use proper Assyrian architecture and all that kind of stuff. Lost Kingdom is a great example. And I think that what you're doing by rooting it back in that kind of stuff is you're going in a direction that GW are not going to go in future, because they're not going to use something that grounded because it can't be effectively trademarked and you can't run lawsuits off the back of it.
Yeah, I did when you said about Tomb Kings, I did mutter to myself, yeah, you can't copyright Egypt.
No.
And I think that's exactly what's happened, right? They could have, in the remaster of Tomb Kings and after Total War Warhammer 2 and all that kind of stuff, sold a shed load of that stuff. But instead, you got Ossiarch.
Yeah, which really creeped me out. The face is like... I like the cavalry because they're like creative. I like the different animal heads. It does actually give me a bit of an Egyptian vibe. But the rest of them, the heads.
The
Oh,
noses. Why do skeletons have noses?
Oh, is that? Yeah, that's probably it.
Some skeletons have noses. That's what's weirdest about it. Some skeletons have noses and some don't.
My mate Luke, who I know listens to this podcast, he's a massive undead fan. The man owns an astronomical amount of skeletons. When the Ossiarch Bone Reapers came out, I think he gave me the one sentence that just summed it up of, how do you do skeletons wrong?
Yeah.
I think that just summed it up to me. How you actually had to work really hard to do this wrong.
Especially because you could go in any other direction. They could have been Celtic skeletons. Do you know what I mean? They could have been They could have been Japanese skeletons. There's so much that you can do that grounds things in an aesthetic that real humans really created.
Yeah, I think that does also cut you off a market as well, because people will recognize that and go, I recognize that. And in some cases, some people are even related to it and will buy into it. Like, I believe that for a very long time, Bretonnians were the most popular Warhammer army in France
That's cool.
because they liked that sort of nudge, nudge, wink, wink towards them. But if you just drop it, then no one's got any connection. There's no soul.
But I think there's something positive about this, though, because I think that you and the mothership are going in different directions. And if we take the Hobgrotz as an indicative of what direction Chaos Dwarfs even are going to come in future, what we're looking at here is something where you've got your stuff, they've got their stuff, and Ninth Age is getting iteratively, more and more distinctive of a flavor, and I love it for that, because new ideas that I think are cool are coming out of that space. They're not hugely coming out of the other space right now.
Yeah, and you know what? The industry's changed so much as well. Let's say Warhammer Fantasy Battles had blown up 20 years ago, and you guys wanted to make from the ground up a square-based fantasy battle system. Where are you going to get your models from for that? Do you know what I mean? Whereas now, it's such a competitive marketplace, and there are so many companies out there, ranging from the kind of very budget to the very high end to like 3D printing and stuff, that we can now as communities come up with rule sets and come up with our universes, and we know that people can now go out and get the miniatures. Whereas previously, we were very much more slaves to what the one big company would produce and would let us have.
Agree with that there. I think the I don't want to call it death, but what GW did with fantasy at the very end actually created a lot of market competition and creativity for that type of fantasy of various races who some people can deny as much as they want, but the old Warhammer fantasy races were, for the most part, almost all based some way on a real historical counterpart, just with a fantasy twist. And that sort of style has exploded. Like you mentioned Lost Kingdom, like their models are fantastic, but you can clearly see the Assyrian motifs in their dwarves, and you can clearly see all the Aztec love that's gone into the lizards, to the point that GW's latest Lord Croak model looks a bit familiar.
Oh yes, doesn't it just?
And I think the thing is, the old world as a setting was a distorted, completely switched up map of the world, with the cultures roughly in the places where you found those countries in the real world, right? You've got all the way over to the east, all of those countries, they are roughly where they are in the world. And the original Scythian hobgoblins, followed by the more explicitly Mongol hobgoblins, they live in that neck of the woods. But I think the thing that I find most interesting is that through your conversion work, Tyranno, you have recreated real human aesthetics with the kind of mask-wearing, heavily armored, immortal style infantry. You've recreated aesthetics out of almost entirely legit GW plastic, correct me if I'm wrong, and then like a massive dose of green stuff over the top of it.
Yeah, a lot of it was actually inspired. I know which ones you're talking about, though. My Immortals, the really, really heavily armored ones, they were inspired mostly because, for some strange reason, GW decided to make Blood Bowl dwarves with Chaos Dwarf-esque masks on them that had this creepy, emotionless expression on them. And I looked at those and went, that is the most Mesopotamian-looking face I have ever seen, like the armor-wise. And I just thought, I want that. And I spent a long time with those models, looking at them and figuring out how to make them into some sort of Chaos Dwarf unit. It did start with me basically just taking the models, arming them with weapons, and then green stuffing sort of skirts on them. But they didn't end up looking the way I wanted. They didn't end up uniform because they were moving too much, and I couldn't cover up all of the Blood Bowl stuff because some of them, you know, they have different positions on the field, so some of them were wearing different armor to the others, so you couldn't really get a uniform look out of them. And eventually, I just bit the bullet and went, "Okay, all right, boys, heads off. You're all going on hammerers."
Another model you used, and I think you might have used it for a giant. Am I right? It used the Slaanesh Demon Prince.
Yes.
Yeah. Now that
Yeah.
model, I own that model because I've got a. I suppose it's technically a little Age of Sigmar Slaanesh warband, but I use it for Warlords of Erewhon. It's like a circle-based little Slaanesh warband, and but that model was one of the reasons why I got it, because I thought that model was just instantly very cool. What I did was I cut the demon off of the top. I just liked the bloke walking forward with the axe. I thought it was very cool. In fact, I thought he was very reminiscent of how Xerxes is portrayed in the 300 movie. And
yes,
I
that is
cool.
100% it.
Yeah.
That is exactly it.
I'm so glad, because when I saw you'd used that for your Middle Eastern army, I was like, I bet you were thinking the same thing as me. Now, my Slaanesh army's much more pink 1980s Realm of Chaos sort of vibe, but it was that Persian-looking character that really sold me on that force. And you used it for the giant, didn't you? You gave him a beard and stuff, am I right?
Yes, yeah, I gave him not only a beard, but I gave him some of the like large-scale replica versions of the Hammerer scale mail around his sort of waist as well, and then mucked around with the arms, and then gave him some big shoulder pads. And he's got a little thing on the back of his neck, which I assume was where the little demon sort of harness sat. But what I did was I took a chain and attached it to it and dragged it down the back to almost look like a collar, to make him look a bit more like a slave. And I even kept the Slaaneshi symbol on his forehead a bit, because then I'm just going to paint it like a burn, like they just branded him, which actually fits in with my slaves, which I might talk about in a bit, maybe not. But yeah, first thing I thought when I looked at that model was, I am a generous god.
That's it.
It just was Xerxes. And even though, I will say this now, 300 is very, very historically inaccurate.
Oh, God,
but, yeah. But that idea of Xerxes, that, how should I put it? Extravagance, almost. And strangeness to him, almost otherworldliness.
Yeah.
Because I had this discussion with someone else the other day. Mesopotamian architecture has a very otherworldly quality to it. It is very odd. Like I think it might be just that we're so used to Greek and Egyptian architecture in our culture that it probably, seeing this third element, which has suddenly become a lot more popular, maybe just weirds us out a little bit by comparison, because we're so used to the Egyptians and the Greeks.
Is there a word more evocative than ziggurat?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it is such a strange word, and it describes such a strange building. Yeah, even though the Aztecs had them as well, but
yeah,
they were doing their own thing with them.
But I mean, is that part of the world where East meets West? Is that part of the world where, you know, Greeks on one side and Persians on the other? I'm sure the Persians probably told stories about how strange the Greeks were and vice versa. Is that kind of like a real meeting of cultures, and cultures being alien to one another? And you mentioned about the film 300 there not being historically accurate. God, no, of course it's not. But I've always liked to think, you know how the film's a bit of a frame narrative with the soldier who was at the Battle of Thermopylae? And
I think I know where you're going with it.
Yeah, and he's there rousing the troops. I always figured that 300 isn't what happened. 300 is the story he told about what happened.
Yeah.
That's how I always viewed it.
That's how I view 300 as well. It's the perfect piece of Spartan propaganda.
Yeah.
And that's what it was, never intended to be historically accurate or even remotely friendly to the Persians. That guy who actually got his eye gouged out in the battle, he actually it wasn't gouged out, because the real guy did exist, and his eye was just got a small infection, and he was ordered to return home because he couldn't hold his shield properly to protect everyone. And in that battle, you see right at the end where he's leading everyone, he actually breaks formation in the real world. He breaks formation and he just goes on a berserk frenzy and slaughters a load of Persians. And he'd had all his military honors removed because they thought he was a coward, because they didn't believe him when he came back. and said, "Oh, I was sent home for an eye infection," and they were like, "Yeah, right, mate." But after he, I know. But then after the battle where he slaughtered a load of Persians, he was basically, his family was sent an apology, and they're like, "Oh, here's all his military honors back, but we won't give him any more than what he already had because he broke ranks, and that is not Spartan." So if you ever see Spartans breaking ranks, that's also a load of crap.
Fantastic.
Assassin's Creed. Yeah. I did actually use also the 300 versions of the Immortals a tiny bit, because that's where I got the mask idea from.
Yeah.
Partly. But I did base them mostly off the historical Immortals with their sort of spears up and big shields and the scale mail. But also I did base the hats on the sort of Babylonian royalty sort of style hats.
Yeah.
Like the little sort of the tall hat thing. But interestingly, if you've been looking at my blog, you'll actually see that I use some blackguard hats, and those are almost exactly what Assyrians used to wear. They wore hats almost in battle, like the blackguard for the Dark Elves, but minus the spikes, because I don't think anyone really like. There's only one civilization we know who wore like horned spikes into battle, and that was the Mycenaeans. But because it's not a good idea.
No, it's not, is it? I know all those wonderful Viking operas. They lied to us.
Yeah, and even then, the Mycenaean horns are at the front of the head, not the side.
Yes, they are. Yeah.
So it's not like to get in the way of your mate to one side. But also, Mycenaeans fought very differently to Greeks, so they weren't very formation focused. So it was probably a lot like more okay to accidentally swing your horned head around, because you won't gouge someone's armpit or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, that fact, like finding out the Blackguard had an identical helmet was like a gold mine for me, because like, all right, just take that.
Yeah, definitely. And you talk about like spikes and stuff. I think that's when when you've got a fantasy army that is inspired by real life, that's where you have your creative freedom, don't you? If you want to do skulls and spikes and slightly over the top weapons and all that kind of stuff, that's where all that fantasy stuff comes in. But it's still rooted in something recognizable and believable.
Yeah, I actually trimmed down some of the great axes that some of my dwarves were holding, because I thought that the ones GW had were so large it looked a bit almost too much, but also because some of the the ones who have the great weapons in there, they are like the lowest infernal dwarf. I mean, it's still pretty high by most army standards, but they're since they're the low guys, I thought give them the smallest axes, just to make them a bit like not too much.
Yeah. Awesome.
I did actually use another inspiration source other than just the Near East. We mentioned Elder Scrolls earlier, but have any of you NWAs played Morrowind?
I've never played Morrowind. No, unfortunately, I'm a filthy Skyrim casual.
Oh, you should play Morrowind, or even better, play the remake that's coming out, because fans are remaking Morrowind, but in Skyrim's engines. But I used Morrowind as a base as well for inspiration, mostly for the basing style, because Morrowind is based in an ash wasteland, and I thought that's very sort of dwarfy. Because here's the little thing: I don't like lava bases. I know that might sound like heresy in a Chaos Dwarf form, but I don't like lava bases because I think it detracts the eye too much from the model, and I feel like if you're going to have like so much work put in an army, don't make the bases ridiculously extravagant, because then you'll just drag the eye away from your work. But
I also don't like lava bases, but that's because I have no talent. Whereas I can do an ash base with a dry brush and some black paint.
Yeah, see, my Chaos Dwarfs have lava bases, but that's mostly to draw your eye away from my paint jobs, and I can do lava bases really well.
But I love the ash waste aesthetic, Tyranno. It is. I also think if you're going to go for the Darklands style environment, that is what they would actually be walking around on. There aren't that many open lava pits,
and you wouldn't tread on them, because I don't care how
of all the places to stand.
Yeah, that's it. You'd be nowhere near them. Now, talking of that, if you had have picked a more fantastical basing scheme, something otherworldly, something lavary or something, it may well have detracted slightly from the historical roots that you've put in there. It might have broken our immersion a little bit into what you're creating. Because I think with a base, you are kind of you're not just doing a base, are you? You're doing these are the guys and these are where they're from. You're kind of doing that, or at least this is where they're fighting. And my lava-based ones are for my 1990s cartoony big hats. So they're bonkers. They could be anywhere. But yours are very believable and historically inspired. So I think having an ash waste for them, that really makes sense.
Thank you. Yeah, it does sort of fit with a slightly more toned down look I'm going for. One of the sort of Elder Scrolls-esque thing I added to my army is, has anyone here looked through the models? Because I made a single post about this with just one picture. Did you see my slave, perchance? Rather, the orcs?
So I did. And your slave, let me see if I can read the miniature from memory, Tyranno, and let me see what I can do here. So he's holding a Stormcast Eternal shield, or is it a Tomb King shield?
It's a Tomb King one. I use Tomb King for everything except for my Immortals. They're the ones who get the biggest.
And his head, he's like a skinny slave runt fella, but his head is off of the new undersea elven faction. They've got those infantry who don't have any eyes.
Yep, in fact, the whole body is from it.
Oh, that's really interesting. And for once, you got more than one component out of a kit, which I think is admirable, given the way that you use single items from a whole kit. And I think, what happened to the rest of the kit? It amazes me. And he is based on like Falmer. Is that what they're called? The little blind elves that live in the mines.
Yeah.
It's a mix. It is partially, the blindness is based on the Falmer, and in fact, the Falmer were blinded by the Elder Scrolls version of the Chaos Dwarves, because they do have Chaos Dwarves in Elder Scrolls, or rather they did, but they're extinct, which is a shame because I really wanted to play as one. Surprise, surprise. But they're also based on a monster you could fight in Morrowind called the Ash Slave, which was basically a dark elf that had gone like completely insane due to a corruption. Big plot thing. I'm not going to spoil it or tell it because it's very long and very deep. But basically it was a elf that had no eyes and its skin was all burnt. And the only things it was wearing was rags. And I thought, that's a fantastic look. And I'm going to go for that. So I spent ages like stripping the Idoneth Deepkin model of all of its armor except for the collar, which I kept. And I'm painting the same as my Chaos Dwarf armor to make it look like collars they've placed around them to sort of keep them like in check. And then I used chains on the between the feet to make them have a bit of a chain gang look. I know it doesn't make quite a lot of sense because it does make them worse at fighting, but I mean their stats are pretty crap anyway, so it doesn't matter too much there. But I then sculpted loads of sort of cloth around them, around the arm, like not around the arms, around the waist to hide any of the Idoneth stuff I'd gouged off, and around the legs because the legs are covered in a lot of armor. But it did make them look bandaged and like their legs were bleeding from all the walking they've been forced to do. There's even a tiny bit of a historical reference in them. Do you see how he's holding his shield in both hands?
Yeah.
That's something the Assyrians used to do. Well, not them personally, but they would get slaves to hold a shield in two hands and they'd line them up in a wall and then they'd get their archers to walk behind them. And so they could have a moving archer line.
Is that a Sparabara?
I don't remember the name, but it is what they basically just had walking shield walls and they would just peek over the top, fire, and duck behind again.
So dark.
Very vicious. I mean, it's a step up from the Mongols just not giving anyone anything and just making their slaves just die.
Yeah.
But it's pretty brutal. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to reference this with the shields because I was thinking for ages about making them carry stuff and things like that. But then I read about the shield thing and I was like, that is disturbing. I'm doing that.
You've actually inspired me. I won't ask you now. Please do finish what you're about to say. But I've got to remember, I've got a big, important Hobgoblin question to ask you in a minute.
No problem. I was going to say one other thing is just the model below it. You may have spotted something that looks like a giant dwarf mouth that's sort of yawning on the back of a construct.
Yeah.
Are any of you guys old enough to remember the Chaos Dwarf Juggernaut?
Not old enough, but I know the model from internet searches and such. I know Chitz definitely does.
I sold one just last month.
You sold it to my mate, I think.
I did sell it to your mate at a very good price.
Yeah, I mean, now you can holiday in the Bahamas for a week.
I wish. Whatever you do, listeners, don't pay the eBay price for the juggernauts they've got on there. Do not do it. Call me. My DMs are open.
Yeah, I know how to use eBay pricing. Never go what you see. Always go by like what's sold, not what's selling. Anyway,
Absolutely.
Part of my job. But anyway, this thing is part of basically Infernal Dwarves got a new book relatively recently, and it's still being worked on, but it's like only in the final stages now of public testing. This is something Ninth Age does a lot. Is we have a lot of public testing, so the community is involved quite a lot by comparison to, say, Games Workshop, who basically just drop the book on you and go, here, go away. So, do what you want, but don't come back to us with feedback. But yeah, this was a unit we added, which is basically, it was based on both the Juggernaut and it was based on the Assyrian Siege Tower. And while the book was being designed, I got curious and decided to see if there are any applicable models for it. And I found that for some reason, in 2003, some historical company made kits for it.
I actually think I've seen those somewhere.
Yeah, I just Googled it and I was like, oh, they're very cheap and the quality was very high, although building it was like chewing your own arm off. Like, oh my God. And it's shocking though, because the detail is so high. It's such a good model, especially for the time period. Like, GW wasn't making plastic kits that good back then. Like, it's amazing. But then I thought, I got to dwarfify this. And I remembered that big magma thing, like, face. And I thought, ooh, hang on. And so I didn't put the front of the tower on and sort of changed the back of it so it would fit with the head. And then I cut the lower jaw off and lowered it to the bottom of the opening for the battering ram, and then put some plastic card to make it like the jaw just stretched. So it was a little bit of just trying to make it fit, but also it was like that scene from The Mummy where Imhotep sort of controls the sand and he makes his jaw just stretch.
Yes.
So it's another bit of a antiquity reference there.
So just while we're on antiquity, have you seen the Victrix Persians, Tyranno?
Oh, I saw them and I got really annoyed that I'd already like made hobgoblins and made everything I wanted because I saw those and I was like,
just go as mad as I do and just buy them anyway and then have human war slaves. I've got 2 regiments of them. They're very cheap. They're good plastic. They're a little bit multi-part monopose, just for anyone who's listening. They're a little bit multi-part monopose in that they do have lots of components, but they only really go together in a couple of basic shapes.
Yeah.
But they are cracking. And then also Victrix have got fantastic elephants. If anyone wants something to convert into Tyranno's big rhino beasts, you can use the Victrix war elephants, which come 2 to a pack for a very good price.
Yeah, really affordable, aren't they?
You don't have to sell Victrix to me. Trust me, I have an entire army all made from Victrix stuff, and I have various units of that, like other units in other places. Like I literally have an entire Viking, or rather Nordic army built from their models, and with a few fantasy elements thrown in. Like finding out they made plastic Huskarls was just like Christmas. I was like,
yeah. No, I'm a fan of theirs. I very nearly, I was going to take the plunge and buy a lot of their early Imperial Rome range, because I'd previously got hold of very cheap the Warlord games, plastic Imperial Romans, but they look great. But then when you actually put them next to a 28mm model, you quickly realise it's being advertised as 28mm, and it's definitely 25mm. I know the Italians were supposed to be shorter than the Gauls, but that's ridiculous. They're really.
I was going to say that because I'm the human war slave army that I'm putting together mixes dogs of war in heavy armor with like Victrix humans and other stuff like that. And I was going to caution people the same thing. The elephants, in particular, the scale of a monster that you would find on a normal Warhammer Fantasy big base versus how big an elephant actually historically is compared to a person, it's going to look smaller than you're expecting. So if you choose to go down the Victrix route, that is a good thing for a Chaos Dwarf player, but just don't mix in other scales of humans. And then they'll look proportional. They're not heroic scale, and they won't be.
Well, this is why I've embraced 3D printing with my Romans now, so that I'm printing my Romans at really, really stupid, unbelievable scales. So they look normal next to my Warhammer models.
Yeah, they do look hilarious. You should post them up on the forum.
I think I have somewhere. Oh no, I haven't posted these ones yet. I'm part way through.
No, not yet.
When they're up, you'll see them. As I think Chitz described them as chunky boys.
They are. They're like the proportions of those Stormcast from the first edition of AOS Tyranno.
Oh God, that's awful. I was going to say though, maybe it's because it's an Indian elephant. That's why it's so small compared to the African. You were saying about the Warlord Games Romans. I actually did buy some of them, but not for the use for the Romans. I actually bought their bolt throwers, and I've used them for the Hobgoblin ones.
Yeah, I own the bolt throwers. It's quite a nice little kit. Actually, their auxiliary kit is really well scaled as well. Their scales are all over the place, unfortunately. Their auxiliaries are really well scaled, but their legionaries are tiny.
I think there's a reason for that. I think that's because Warlord don't actually do many of their own sculpts.
No,
they actually have other mini companies doing it for them.
They
because
I
used
War Games Factory, I believe, and I think the legionaries are old War Games Factory models.
Yeah, because I used to buy War Games Factory's Japanese models, and then their website said, "Oh, we're actually with them now," and I was like, "Okay."
Yeah.
So that's how I figured out they were there. Oh, my Japanese army is great. It was so cheap under War Games Factory. Like, oh my God.
The one thing I would say to people, just to conclude the kind of Victrix human detour that we've gone on, is that you have to understand that the reason that the scales are a bit weird is because there are like 5 or 6 historical ancients kind of mini companies, only a handful of whom we've just named, and they try to sell minis that are broadly compatible with each other because they're all servicing the same market, and they're not in ugly GW style exclusivity competition. And so they are just unable to cross the bridge fully into heroic scale because they would be kind of out of step with their friends, as it were, which doesn't really sing.
Yeah.
I wanted to pivot us a bit back towards Hobgoblins. There are 2 things I wanted to mention before I asked my super important headwear-based question. I did just want to check question. You note the aesthetic of the upcoming Hobgrotz releases. You look at things like the bolt thrower and stuff like that. It's very ramshackle. And I'm getting the feeling from the way that you're describing this quite well-organized nation of Hobgoblins with a proper hierarchy that they're not going to have that kind of ramshackle feel unless you decide to model them in that way. Is that part of your vision for them, Tyranno, that they're a bit cleaner and more organized?
I wouldn't say they're cleaner. I'd say that they just build things to make them more efficient. So those new bolt throwers that have been shown off by GW are probably actually really good because those orcs are really, really serious about what they're doing.
Yeah.
So
that's true.
I'd say that actually fits perfectly fine. It's the stuff like Fanatics, there's all the stuff they don't do. Like the Hobgoblins won't basically stuff some guy full of drugs, give him a big iron wrecking ball, and chuck him away. But they will build
Doom divers.
Yeah, no doom divers, those sorts of things. No, but they will build things that are efficient and effective, even if they look a bit spiky and barbed and horrid. Also, the other idea with the Hobgoblins is they do a lot of trade with the Infernal Dwarves to get some stuff off them. So, for example, one of the unique items for the Infernal Dwarves is something called Infernal Armor, which is like plate armor but it protects you from fire as well. The Infernal Dwarves can take this on quite a few units, including some core units. but the Hobgoblins have a few special units that have it as well because they've bought it, and so some of their armor will be effectively dwarven made, but the stuff they make themselves is still pretty effective. That's why they've got cataphracts, where they're like got a barded mount and they can wear heavy armor, and they've got a shield and they've got a lance. It's all still effective, even though it might look a bit spiky and nasty.
That is really cool and also really reassuring, because I'm buying that bolt thrower and putting it next to my old school 93 bolt thrower, and I think they're both going to look cracking. So that's really cool.
It's a lovely model, and I'm really happy that someone wanted to split this with me, because some of the stuff in here is absolutely fantastic. But we have so there's even more stuff you could have used, because there's a creature in the Hobgoblin book called a drum gogyag. Word gogyag is a goblin-esque word meaning big pet, so it basically just means some sort of big creature. But the idea behind that unit was it's a monster that can join units of infantry, and that's sort of all it does. But it's to give this really cool visual of big monsters striding amongst the infantry. But GW have made this big troll thing, and you could easily just put him on the base and slap him with them as well.
That is something that I look forward to very strongly. But before I can engage any further, I've got some very important questions, and you must answer them without delay. Question number 1. In your vision for the Hobgoblins, do they wear shoes or not?
For my models, they wear sort of foot wrappings. So sometimes a toe will be poking out, or some toes will be poking out, but they try to cover their toes up. It's just like yes and no.
Interesting. Bare feet are an important and controversial topic amongst Hobgoblin fans, because some of the original 93 Hobgoblin range had bare feet and some did not. And so some of the successor ranges, including some of the ones that we spoke about in our previous podcast, have explicitly reproduced the barefooted Scythian-hatted Hobgoblin, and others have not. But Tyranno has spoken. In the 9th Age, some Hobgoblins wear shoes, some Hobgoblins do not wear shoes. Question 2. What is the correct form of headwear for the average Hobgoblin? Is it a Scythian peaked hat, or is it a Mongolian-styled luvuz, or is it that weird helmet that we saw the Hobgrotz wearing?
It's I've got a better one. It's generally it's a iron helmet if you're wearing armor, and if you're not wearing armor, they generally will wear nothing, or they will wear a sort of not quite a cloth cap, but sort of like a little, almost like a hood, but not like a Night Goblin one where they got the point where it's pointy. It's more like a low flat hood. The best description is basically just look for what Sassanid infantry have.
Hugely controversial, of course, but this is Chaos Dwarfs Online, the forum that brought you helmets, hats, or both, right, as a barrier to entry. And I just thought there is a Hobgoblin angle on that question, and it's all to do with headwear as well. You've survived my grilling, Tyranno. Thank you for telling us what they wear in the 9th Age, straight from the author's mouth. Oxy, what else do we want to cover?
I was gonna say, I'm not the guy who came up with the background, so I'm not the be-all, end-all on what they wear. I'm more of what what armor they wear rather than their clothes. What they wear on a day-to-day basis, you'll have to ask the background, or even just look in the book, because it has little background elements for every single unit. Because we've added a little blurb for them. This is one nice thing the auxiliaries have, is because we don't have the resources to make them quite as good looking as the main armies, rather than having like devote a whole page to a unit and then another whole page to a unit's description. In the actual army book itself, there's a little paragraph for everyone. So, but it's quite useful. So if you just look at the unit, you can just read what it is immediately and go, okay, now I understand.
That is cracking, and I'm really looking forward to getting my hands on the book when it is available.
I mean, it's available now.
Oh, fantastic. Sign me up.
Yeah, it released about Thursday.
We'll stick some links in the description of this today, so that people can who are listening can click straight away and have a look at the army book. And we'll do a link to your Dwarvish Mesopotamia blog as well while we're at it, so viewers can have a look at that as well. Is there anything else, mate, that you'd like to kind of shout out? Any blogs, any social media, any way that people can engage with what you're creating, or if there's something else that other people are creating that you think you'd like to point people in the direction of?
For the first thing, I have an Instagram called Tyranno Sculpts. Mostly what I post there is actually tips and tricks for sculpting and model making, and perhaps a little bit of, because I'm not an amazing painter, I'm just an okay one. I've also post guides around making your painting easier when it regards to modeling, aka don't stick the shields on until before spraying, stick them on afterwards, that sort of thing. But I put up sculpting guides and sculpting tips on my Instagram to make it more than just a load of collection of pretty models. I would also just like to shout out basically my team and thank them for all the hard work. We really burned the midnight oil to make this book, and frankly the reception, this is the next thank you, is just to everyone who's thanked us for the book. The reception has been absolutely overwhelming. I didn't imagine it was going to be this popular. The simple fact of someone opening a thread in the 9th Age forums for Hobgoblins before I even could just shows how keen people were for this book, and it's been absolutely amazing. If anyone also is playing the army or wants to play the army and has any feedback, we are taking feedback on the 9th Age forum. Just go into log on and make an account, of course, because otherwise you can't post. Pretty simple. But if you scroll down to the Infernal Dwarves section, there's a little sort of header under it that says Hobgoblins. But there should be multiple threads there, and there'll be several ones. And if you just post in at least one of them, you'll get my attention, and I'll look at your feedback and see what you have to say about the book. Because again, this is all basically the fans do have control. Fan ideas have made their way into books, and some fan ideas certainly haven't, because there's a lot of people. But any good idea is something worth looking at.
Excellent. All right, thank you. Thank you so much for your time today, Tyranno. Thank you for chatting to us from everything from Hobgoblins to Chaos Dwarfs to Hollywood films to ancient history to different miniature companies, Age of Sigmar, everything. It's been really, really lovely having you here as a guest. And as I say, I do urge everyone to click the links below to go and check out Tyranno's personal blog on CDO, to check out the Hobgoblin army book they've created. And as Tyranno says, if you're out there and you're playing 9th Age, please give these guys your feedback. It seems like this community is really, really receptive at continually updating and creating. So that feedback can be really valuable to them to make sure that this game stays as tight and as balanced as it is right now. So yeah, Tyranno, thank you so much for your time, mate.
No problem. Anytime. And I do mean anytime. I've had invitations for podcasts coming out my ears.
Excellent. And actually, I think that brings us to the end of today's podcast. This is going to be the last segment of the podcast. So we'll actually take this opportunity to say goodbye to our listeners. Don't forget, those of you listening at home, it's the Chaos Dwarfs online forum is the place to be on the internet. So please come down. We've got competitions running. We've got amazing blogs. You've seen a lot of Tyranno's work today, and he is one of many inspiring creators on that platform. But you can see their work, you can engage them, you can submit and create your own. We've got an amazing community there with our zine, with our podcast, and with all the people creating. So we'd love to see you all over at the forum. But for now, unfortunately, that is all that we have time for. So we are going to say good night and goodbye. Take care. See you later.
Bye.